Chapter 1. A Strange Experience. Ugh. It feels like all my nerves were ripped out of my body and then stomped on for good measure. The last thing Percy remembered was the thrill of finally reaching Orange after a decade of relentless effort. The jeers and sneers from his cousins and uncles had only pushed him onward. He'd done it, tripled his remaining lifespan, and achieved a new level of power. He'd made it. His first act had been to try tapping into his family's bloodline once more. The clone ability had always eluded him, but perhaps now, with his newly strengthened core, things would be different. He remembered the initial rush of mana and then pain. A lot of pain. A world of pain. I'm not exactly an expert, but I don't think excruciating agony is a common side effect of using a bloodline ability. As he fought to open his eyes, he was greeted by a strange sight. A creature with humanoid features, but certainly not human, stood before him. Its skin was pale as milk, its eyes pitch black, resembling obsidian orbs that glimmered with an emotion Percy couldn't quite discern. Worry, perhaps? The creature's strained smile and tightly clenched fists at the edge of the crib betrayed its concern. There was another standing opposite the first, this one bulkier. A male? It was hard to tell. Both were hairless and wore baggy robes concealing any distinguishing traits. Percy raised his hands with difficulty, noticing they were tiny and the same pale color as the giants around him. His skin was smooth as porcelain. What's happening? Who are these people? He tried to speak, to ask a question, but no sound emerged. To his horror, he realized he couldn't breathe. The female, at least, he thought it was female, panicked, moving a device to his mouth and casting an air spell. A breath was forced into his lungs and, though it hurt, it kept him conscious. Barely. Scanning his surroundings, he noticed the walls were sleek, made of some polished material. They definitely didn't have anything of the sort back on Remir. Strange decorations adorned the room. There was a painting that seemed to have been drawn in 3 dimensions. Somehow, through the window, he glimpsed 3 suns, green, yellow, and blue, illuminating a turquoise sky. At any other time, Percy might have appreciated the novelty of the situation. Right now, however, it only brought him unease. Desperately, he turned to the only source of familiarity he could think of. His status tab. He summoned it, hoping it still worked. Guhat, Percival's clone. What the hell? His relief at being able to check his status was quickly replaced by shock. Guhat was probably the name given to this body, but what did it mean by Percival's clone? Wasn't he the real Percy? Wait, clone? I succeeded? Under other circumstances, he would be ecstatic. His family had given him a ton of grief over his inability to use it. Everyone, Percy included, thought he simply hadn't inherited it. But this wasn't how it was supposed to work. Fueled by their life affinity, the Avalon House's bloodline allowed them to cultivate a biological copy of themselves to delegate dangerous or tedious tasks to. Did I inherit a mutated version? Or is it because I don't have the life affinity? Percy had never been sure of his affinity. The standard test at age 5 had shown nothing, but there was a slim chance he had a rare affinity it couldn't detect. Of course, better tests existed, but his family hadn't thought it worth the resources on a red core like him. Let's see what I'm dealing with here, he thought, focusing on his status once more. Guhat, Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1, red? Mana core 2, red?
Ew.
Grants access to your status. Grants a second mana core. What? Losing his orange core stung given how long it took to get there. But it made sense since he was in a new, infant body. 2 cores, on the other hand? He'd never heard of anyone possessing more than 1. Well, that wasn't quite right. Percy had never heard of a human possessing multiple cores, but he did vaguely recall a rumor of an alien race famous for precisely that. What were they called?
Moi something.
He couldn't remember the exact name, but they stood out even among the countless species the divine order protected his world from. And now, I get to be one of them? His eyes almost sparkled with hope, but he quickly quashed the optimism. What was he thinking? He was just a botched clone who wouldn't survive much longer. His new body barely functioned. He couldn't even breathe without assistance. Everything hurt, and he felt himself beginning to collapse. Even if he survived, both his cores were red, leaving him at the bottom of the pecking order here as well. No, I can't give up so easily. I want to live. I want a chance. He clawed desperately at his fading consciousness. The pain was excruciating, as if he were being ground to dust, but he refused to give up. He didn't care he was just a clone. He didn't care his cores were red. He had to fight with what he had, to live with what he had, to make the most of what he had. But sometimes sheer will wasn't enough. The air affinity spell was beginning to hurt more than it helped. His heart felt like it was about to burst, darkness seeping into his vision. At the same time, an inescapable force pulled him, slowly prying him out of the broken body. As Guhat's eyes closed, the blurry silhouettes of the couple he guessed were his parents faded, their distraught cries replaced by silence. His final thought was a bitter one. I'm sorry for putting you guys through this. Chapter 2, Alive. Percy was pulled towards a certain direction. It was as if a tight rope was glued to his back, forcing him to travel, to plunge through a seemingly infinite darkness, unable to resist. He couldn't tell how long it took. Maybe a week, a year, a century. Either way, his mind was murky, his thoughts failing to fully form. Perhaps this was purgatory, his punishment for casting that ability. It's not like he'd known what it would bring, but he appeared destined to pay the price all the same. At least it wasn't so bad. He was at peace. The pain was gone. Until it wasn't. A throbbing headache was the first new sensation, followed by warmth. He instinctively took a breath and then another, and a third, ecstatic to have functioning lungs again. Next, he tried prying his eyes open, but his sight was blocked by something wet. A towel? He tried lifting his hands, but his limbs were weak. In the end, he shrugged, or he would have if he could. Instead, he just remained in that position, enjoying the rhythmic sound of his own heartbeat. Did they manage to fix me? He opened his status again, but what greeted him wasn't at all what he expected. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange.
Ew.
Mana core 2. Seed.
Ew.
Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity.
Ew. Hey.
Grants access to your status.
Hey.
Grants a bloodline.
Hey.
Fractured. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life and mind mana to germinate. Holy shit. The shock somehow gave him the energy to sit up, the wet towel falling from his face. Glancing around, he found he was back in his room. His human body. No Guhat or Percival's clone? I guess the clone's memories return to me when it dies. He exhaled in relief. Not only was he somehow still alive, but it appeared he wouldn't be condemning a version of him to a horrible fate every time he used his bloodline. More importantly, there it is. My orange core is back. Also, the clone bloodline. This was Percy's first time seeing his bloodline listed in his status. Not because he didn't have it before now. Both bloodlines and core affinities were fixed from birth. Naturally, he had clone his whole life. He just hadn't known. The status page wasn't omniscient. The only things it could detect through the simple test most kids underwent at age 5 were the starting grade of one's mana core and the common elemental affinities. As for rarer affinities and bloodlines, those required a more specialized investigation, which was only reserved for kids lucky to be born at orange or higher. The rest had to either earn enough money to pay for the test, or to slowly discover their affinities and bloodline, if they even had any on their own. But what is this section with the question marks? He frowned. He had never seen or heard of anything like that. Still, most of its contents weren't new. This section seemed to contain 3 separate items. One was access to the status itself, which everyone had. Another was the access to his bloodline. It appeared to be like a hidden section. Did it become visible because I brought this other thing back? Percy wasn't sure what to make of this. He seemed to have partially retained the unique trait of the alien body, but not the complete version. His second core was in a dormant state at a grade below even red. He wasn't sure if it could be salvaged. Either way, this is good. His core had advanced to orange, and it turned out he did have clone despite what everyone told him. Finally, he probably had a rare affinity too. At least, he couldn't imagine doing what he'd done with pure mana. Even if I can't get the second core to work, I'm still better off than before. Not that he wouldn't try, of course. He was about to make a mental checklist of things he needed to do, when the door opened. Percy! A female voice yelled. His ears were sensitive, the shout giving him a buzz. Still, he barely raised his arms to shield himself from the incoming aquamarine-haired missile. A silhouette leapt on top of him, the two bouncing on the mattress. She hugged him tightly, as if he was about to disappear. It's all right, Elaine. I'm all right. The girl hugging him, Elaine, was the only member of his family who didn't treat him like shit. In fact, the only reason he hadn't been kicked out entirely was probably because Elaine had been born at Yellow, which made her one of the more talented members of the house. Naturally, it gave her some sway with their grandpa. What do you mean you're all right? She yelled. I found you on the floor. You've been out cold for a week. I had to use my water magic to feed you soup. Percy raised an eyebrow. He hadn't quite realized he'd been unconscious for so long. He felt a pang of guilt for worrying her, but also a fuzzy feeling in his chest. If it wasn't for Elaine, they'd have probably left him alone to die. That's assuming they even realized he was missing. I'm sorry. I tried to use clone upon advancing, and it had a weird interaction with my affinity. Elaine let go of him, covering her mouth in surprise. Advancing? She asked as she closed her eyes, trying to sense his mana. Oh my god. You've reached orange. Percy rolled his eyes at her reaction. He knew she was just happy for him, but it wasn't that strange he had advanced. Most people took about 10 years for their first promotion, so reaching orange at 15 was pretty much expected of him. If anything, nobles typically had access to resources doubling their purification speed. All his cousins had advanced at 10. Sadly, those resources weren't abundant enough to be wasted on lowly reds. The world of Remir was a cruel one, where the talented were showered with resources, letting them grow even faster, while the rest were left in the dust. Elaine, who was roughly the same age as him, had already advanced to green years ago. In any case, it was only a few seconds later that she seemed to grasp the rest of what he'd said. Wait, you said you have clone and an affinity. I told Grandpa to test you properly before writing you off. Yeah, right. As if Baldy would waste a copper on his worst grandkid. Percy chuckled. Elaine flicked his forehead, causing him to wince. Stop calling him that. I know he needs to start treating you better, but this isn't helping. Percy wanted to protest that it was just a shorthand for the guy's name. Archibald. Baldy. Also, he didn't have a single hair on his head, so it fit. But they'd had that conversation before, and he was too tired to get into it again. In the end, he shrugged. Well, this is all wonderful news. Have you figured out what your affinity is? She spoke again. Percy shook his head. No, but I'm 100% sure I do have one. It wasn't just optimism speaking. Bloodlines were hereditary. Occasionally, somebody would fail to inherit one from their parents, and on even rarer occasions their bloodline would mutate into a new direction. Still, for the most part they were passed along intact. Affinities were less hereditary. Sometimes one would inherit one from their parents. Other times they wouldn't. But there were exceptions. The clone bloodline his family possessed was strongly correlated with the rare life affinity. Most members of the Avalon house tended to inherit both, while few got neither. It was a potent combination which made their family one of the stronger noble houses, even though they lacked a white core. Still, there had been instances over the centuries when individuals would be born with the clone bloodline and a different affinity. And there had even been cases where people had the bloodline and no affinity. But no other combination ever did anything noteworthy. The only explanation for Percy's misadventure was that he had an affinity never before seen in his family. Then we need to ask Grandpa to get you a proper test, Elaine said, grabbing him by the forearm. He nearly stumbled as he was pulled, his legs still a bit wobbly, but he managed to follow her without falling. Truth be told, Percy wasn't exactly thrilled at the prospect of asking his grandpa for a favor. The man had never deigned to give him anything, despite the rosier version of him in Elaine's head. Still, he needed to figure out what his affinity was before he could even begin to understand how to use it. If he had to pay for the test himself, it would take him several more years, as he had already used up his savings for his advancement. So, in the end, he swallowed his pride and hoped his cousin would help advocate his case for him. Besides, Baldy had something else he needed. A potent source of life mana. Huh? I bet that qualifies. Chapter 3: A Meeting with Baldy. Come in, an authoritative voice said. Elaine opened the door, dragging Percy behind her. The two found a man sitting at his desk. The afternoon sun reflected off the top of his head. Despite his shaved scalp, he didn't look old. His appearance was that of a burly man still in his late 20s, even though he had lived for centuries. Grandpa, the girl said, clearly eager to share the good news. Archibald lifted his eyes, his gaze briefly lingering on Percy, before it returned to the documents he was reading. The latter rolled his eyes, realizing this was already a lost cause. But his cheerful cousin didn't seem ready to give up just yet. She bit her lower lip for a moment before speaking again. Grandpa, Percy is okay. The answer is no. The man cut her short. Just hear me out. He has managed to. Elaine. Archibald stopped her again. I can tell he's at Orange. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. You know that already. The girl deflated, looking down at her feet. On Remier, the most important trait determining one's achievements in life was the grade of their mana core at birth. Sure, one could continue to advance throughout their lives, but each promotion was exponentially more difficult than the one before. The first typically required about a decade, the second a century, the third a millennium, and so on. Having access to more valuable resources could have each of those milestones, of course, but that didn't affect the way they scaled. At the same time, each subsequent grade typically tripled one's physical and magical ability as well as their remaining lifespan. Somebody who spent their whole life at Red would only live about 80 years at most, while somebody at Orange would get 240. Naturally, this meant that somebody like Percy would never get to Green in his life. Having reached Orange at 15, he could maybe hope to reach Yellow by 115 and then remain stuck at that level until he died of old age at 400. Even if his grandpa decided to treat him to the same resources his cousins had access to and he reached Yellow by 65, he would only live to about 500, which wouldn't be enough for the next grade. By comparison, somebody born at Orange, just one grade above Percy, could potentially live for thousands of years and reach all the way to Blue 2 grades above him. As for those born at Yellow like Elaine and Archibald, they could even reach Violet and White, living up to 40,000 years. Percy's grandpa was already at Violet, having lived for over 700 years, but he still had several millennia of lifespan left as well as the hope of reaching White. Elaine clenched her fists. He can still be of value to the family. His mana core and lifespan may be capped at Yellow, but he can still pass his bloodline and affinity on, she said. For the first time since the two walked into the room, Archibald raised his eyebrows. He tossed another look at his grandson, this time not so quick to dismiss him. You've used clone? He asked. Percy nodded. Actually used it? There have been others without the life affinity in the past, but water clones and pure clones just disperse. Archibald asked again. It definitely did something interesting. As for what exactly, I don't fully understand it yet. His grandpa furrowed his brow at the implications, noticing that Elaine was over the moon. See? Even if Percy can't become too powerful himself, his kids could start a new branch of the family. We should invest in him. Archibald tapped his fingers on the mahogany desk for a few seconds, seemingly lost in thought. What you said makes some sense. We've never had another useful affinity paired with clone. If the new bundle is truly useful and easy to pass on, it could indeed be good for the family, he said. Elaine clapped her hands, excited to receive a positive response, but her grandpa spoke again. However, that doesn't mean we should spend cultivation resources on Percy. 400 years are more than enough for him to sire plenty of children. He doesn't need to be stronger to do that. Percy gritted his teeth. As much as he would have liked those resources, he was more annoyed by the callousness of his grandpa, treating him more like an asset than family. Still, he had agreed to follow Elaine here for a reason, so he didn't let it get to him as he spoke again. I don't want your cultivation resources. I'm only asking for a better affinity test. After all, that can help us both figure out how the bloodline works in my case. The man looked him in the eyes for a while. Very well. Gawain will accompany you for the trip. Elaine too. She can use some experience. Archibald turned back to the scroll, not leaving much room for debate. Still, this worked for Percy and Elaine too, so they rushed out of the office before their grandpa changed his mind. As they walked back to his room, he replayed the conversation in his mind. His hands balled into fists, drained of all color. Faced with his grandfather's coldness, Percy had come this close to spilling the beans on his second mana core. He so wanted to see Baldy's face twist as he learned the grandson he treated like trash had achieved something no human ever had. Not the white cores. Not even the lofty existences in the divine order could boast of such a feat. He had stolen the most important secret of one of the strongest races in the universe. He had done that with a worthless orange core. But he'd held himself back. First of all, it sounded quite unbelievable, and he couldn't exactly prove it. Speaking of the event might have made his grandpa think he was lying about the whole thing and robbed him of the affinity test. More importantly, he owed him nothing. If it wasn't for Elaine, he would have left this shitty family already. Whatever his second core meant for him, he would discover on his own and forge his own path. His biggest regret was that he needed to get close to his grandpa's treasure tree. It was his family's most prized possession, and he hoped it was precisely the potent source of life mana he needed to germinate the seed. Let's leave it for now. If Baldy was so stingy with the affinity test and the cultivation resources, there's no chance he'd let me anywhere near the tree in a million years. But it didn't matter. He knew where it was. He could figure out a way to sneak there later. Besides, he still needed to find a source of mind mana for this to work. Thinking of something, he grinned. As it so happened, the advanced affinity test would be held at precisely such a place. The duo were about to enter Percy's room, but he stopped at the entrance. This caused Elaine to look at him in concern. Percy, don't let this get to you. If your affinity is really useful, we can convince him to give you more resources later. He chuckled. It's not that. I've just realized that I haven't even tried practicing with my core since it evolved. Between everything that happened with the bloodline, I never got the chance. As he was about to head to the training grounds, she grabbed his arm again. Seriously, you were in a coma for a week, and we are about to head out in a couple of days. What you need right now is to get some rest. Percy looked her in the eyes as his lips curled and parted. Smiling, he said, Thanks. Seeing her forehead crease in confusion, he hurriedly added, For caring. You're the only one who does. But I still need to do this. Then he walked away, leaving her behind. It was true he could use some sleep. His mind was still exhausted, his body weak. But he had to get stronger soon. He understood there weren't many people he could rely on. No handouts for him. Everything he needed he had to fight for. Soon he reached the training grounds. Just a section of the garden, really. He briefly paused to appreciate the birds chirping on the trees, and the squirrels bolting up and down their trunks. Then he walked to the middle of the grass, facing a wide, dead oak tree that people typically used for target practice. Nobody else was around right now. His cousins rarely trained. They were mostly content lazing around and gulping expensive elixirs that cleansed their cores and lengthened their lives. They didn't need to practice their magic to be stronger than the likes of him. Shaking the irritating thoughts away, he raised his palm towards the aged trunk and willed his mana to accumulate in his hand. He held it, until the pressure in both his core and mind became unbearable, and then he released it. A faint distortion phased through the tree but didn't do much else. Percy wasn't exactly surprised. His unknown affinity had done nothing back at Red, besides giving people a slight chilling sensation. It was to the point that nobody was sure he even had an affinity back then. But he now knew he did, so he was determined to make it count. He gathered more mana, this time holding it a moment longer and trying to condense it even further before firing. Still didn't do anything, but he didn't care. Again. He kept firing, bolt after bolt, minute after minute, hour after hour. Every so often, he would take a break to refill his core, before resuming his practice. By the time he fell to his knees, the sun had already set. He had practiced as long as he could, and then some, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. Not yet. They all looked down on him. He didn't care about most of them. He was used to it by now. But he cared that Elaine looked down on him. Unlike the others, she didn't do it on purpose. She didn't do it maliciously, but she did it all the same. She had been surprised he had reached Orange at 15. As if it was some great achievement. She had pushed him to beg for scraps from their grandpa. And it stung so much. But he'd never given up on himself. He was the only one who knew. His heart too thrummed with ambition. And one day he would show them. He would show them all. Chapter 4 Whistling Woods. Let's just get this over with. A man seemingly in his 20s said as he climbed on his horse. His hair was a light blue color, like Elaine's. His face sported 8 or 9 points of similarity to hers too. He was Gawain, her father. Funnily enough, he had reached green about the same time as his daughter, despite being around 50 years older. It was the inevitable consequence of being born at Orange and having a child more talented than he was. That, coupled with the fact his branch of the family hadn't inherited the bloodline, meant his status had only ever been slightly higher than the likes of Percy. At least until Elaine came along. Sure, Percy nodded, getting on a second horse with his cousin right behind them on a third. He didn't dislike this uncle of his like the others. They'd never talked much, and it wasn't like Gawain had ever particularly shown any care for him. But at least he wasn't among the crowd mistreating him either. If he had to be escorted to the temple, and he did have to, it was a long and dangerous trip, then he wouldn't have picked anyone else. The horses galloped forward, Percy already feeling excited about their destination. He was still tired, of course, having trained relentlessly over the last 3 days, but the thought of finally learning his affinity after being in the dark his whole life was invigorating. Not to mention the other thing waiting for me there. He grinned. You seem to be in good spirits today. Elaine chirped as her horse neared his. Well, your highness, us lowborns don't get to leave the house very often. He chuckled. This earned him a casual punch in the shoulder. He rubbed the injured area in an exaggerated manner. He made it seem like a joke, but truth be told, it did hurt some. Elaine had 2 grades on him, which translated to a 9-fold advantage in physical strength. Even a light tap from her felt heavier than she realized. Let's see if you're still as cheery after 2 weeks on horseback, she replied with a smile of her own. The trio pressed onward for several more hours, with Elaine and Percy chatting at the back, while Gawain ignored them, riding a few paces ahead. Soon they entered a forest. It smelled fresh, especially to Percy who hadn't ever breathed anything other than the stale air of the mansion. On each side of the path, he saw rows upon rows of tall and wide pine trees, their cones a strange oblong shape, their surface filled with small holes. Every now and then, a gentle breeze would blow, causing them to emit soft high-pitched sounds. It was precisely this unique variety of trees which made the Whistling Woods famous in the region. Only when the sun began to set did Gawain stop, gesturing at them to help him set up camp. They'd have to spend 4 nights in the forest, and another 2 along the grasslands on the other side, before reaching the foot of the mountain where the temple was located on the 7th. Uncle, how safe are these woods even? Percy asked, as he gazed at the imposing trees which already looked much scarier than they had just minutes ago. Gawain chuckled. Don't worry, kid. The most dangerous thing we can run into is a pack of wood goblins. A simple crude spell from a green core can easily kill a whole bunch of them. Percy looked at his grinning cousin, his uncle's words reminding him that the innocent-looking girl was really a little monster in disguise. Shrugging, he finished preparing his tent, before sitting by the campfire with the others and eating some dried rations. The group dined in silence, as he and Elaine had already spent all day chatting. Next, his uncle went to sleep, leaving the 2 to take the first watch together. Percy was too weak to take a shift by himself. If they were ambushed, he might not be able to do much before waking the others. Consequently, Gawain and Elaine had to split the night between themselves, with Percy simply serving as a second pair of eyes for his cousin. In the end, their first night at the Whistling Woods passed uneventfully, as did the one after. It wasn't until the 3rd day they stumbled upon a grizzly bear, but it actually fled from them on sight. Most animals on Remir, even the ones which didn't possess magic of their own, had evolved the ability to sense another's mana core, mostly to avoid danger. Geez, she fell asleep again. Percy rolled his eyes. While Elaine had been a bit tense at the beginning, she had noticeably relaxed over the past few nights. This was the second time she dozed off an hour before their shift ended. He felt bad waking her up, especially since nothing would happen most likely. Still, he knew he couldn't protect the group by himself on the off chance it did. Elaine, he muttered, trying to get her to hear him, without waking his uncle who was sleeping just a dozen yards further. Yet he didn't even hear his own voice. Come to think of it, even the whistling sound of the wind passing through the trees seemed to have gone silent. He frowned. Elaine! He yelled again, this time not caring about waking Gawain by accident. Nothing. He felt his vocal cords vibrate, but not a sound came out of his mouth. Paling, he darted towards her, hoping to shake his cousin awake. An arrow landed soundlessly just in front of his foot, stopping him in his tracks. Another soon followed, this one whizzing by him, nicking him in the shoulder. Turning to look in the direction the projectiles had been fired from, he only spotted several pairs of bright yellow eyes glinting in the darkness. Shit! He thought right as a 3rd arrow hit him in the thigh. Gritting his teeth, he resumed his dash to Elaine. She was only 4 meters away, though they now felt longer as he limped, barely dodging the 4th arrow by accident. He was about to reach her, when the 5th arrow hit his other calf, sending him tumbling on the dirt. Normally, the sound should have woken her up as he was only half a meter away, but something was still muting all noise in the area. Percy stretched his arm, trying to reach her foot as he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Turning his head, he saw a silhouette standing over him. It wasn't very tall, probably shorter than he was. Still, the savage look in its eyes, coupled with the glint of its weapon's edge, some kind of hatchet most likely, were enough to convince him of the danger it posed. As if by instinct, he turned his palm the way of the creature, repeating the same move he'd been practicing over the days leading to the trip. He hurled the mana a second sooner than he would have liked. While he could have charged it some more, he had to stop his assailant before it swung its weapon. Not even waiting to see if it had any effect, he reached for his cousin, this time succeeding. The girl's eyes snapped open, as did her mouth. She tried to scream, but he couldn't hear her. Luckily, she regained her wits a moment later. Just in time too, as she was already surrounded by 3 more of the fiends. A quick flash of azure later, and the upper bodies of all 4 of the goblins, including the one still standing motionless over Percy, were cleanly separated from their legs. Another spell sent a bucket full of water splashing over her father, waking him up. Percy let out a breath he hadn't even noticed he was holding, as his relatives rounded up the remaining goblins. The creatures tried to run away, of course, but their short legs couldn't possibly outrun a green-cored humans. Only now did he take the time to examine the arrows sticking out of his flesh. Riding a horse is going to suck so much tomorrow. Chapter 5 Affinities. A young man rode his horse, his short black hair glistening with sweat. His forehead creased as he tried to keep his mind off the discomfort, focusing on the feeling in his palms. Every few seconds, he released the gathered mana, trying to gather a bit more of it with each attempt and to compress it to an even tighter ball before letting go. Riding made concentrating a challenge, but it was the only way he'd found to keep his thoughts occupied, and he had managed to pull it off, for the most part. At least until his horse stepped on something and the bump made him wince. Elaine hadn't said much over the last couple of days. Well, if he excluded her frequent apologies. She'd already told him how sorry she was over falling asleep a million times. And here she was, approaching him for the 1,000,001st. A beautiful azure ribbon snaked towards him, gently caressing the wounds on his legs. Felt cool and soft, soothing the sting briefly. Still, it couldn't heal him. Back at home, life users were a copper a dozen, and any one of them could patch him up rather easily. Hell, it would take Baldy less than a second if he deigned to waste his mana on him. Sadly, both of his escorts for this trip had the water affinity instead. Such was the cruelty of genetics. He'd have to put up with this for another week. Percy, I'm so sorry, she said again, as he raised his hand to stop her. By now he felt a bit bad seeing her squirm. He was tempted to undersell his injuries to make her feel better. After all, the only reason she and her dad were accompanying him in the first place was because she had pleaded to their grandpa for his sake. But Percy wasn't the best actor. He couldn't downplay the pain. Besides, learning from this mistake would serve her well in the future. Even prodigies couldn't be careless in the wilderness. Just be careful from now on, is what he ended up saying. However, upon seeing her downtrodden expression, he couldn't help himself. It was an accident anyway. Who would have thought we'd run into a goblin mage of all things? He added, most of the creatures were born at red, which was one of the reasons his cousins had often called him Goblin, among other names. A goblin born at orange was actually rarer than a human born at yellow. Even then, they wouldn't necessarily figure out how to use their magic. Come to think of it, that one was probably more talented than I am. He chuckled. Still, the most surprising part about the attack was the affinity it had used. According to Gawain, the silencing effect had most likely been the result of a crude sound spell. Mana affinities typically came in 4 flavors. The 5 elemental affinities were the most common. About 80% of humans on Remir were born with fire, water, air, earth, or lightning cores. Next were those born without an affinity. About 1 in 5 fell into this category. It sucked to be in this category. Not that pure mana was entirely useless. Concentrated, it could still pack a punch. Still, a blast of pure mana was typically about a full grade weaker than it was supposed to be. Less than 1% of the population was born with anything else. This number was further split into 2 groups. One included the rare affinities such as space, time, life, mind, and so on. Those were generally difficult to pass on. His family was an exception, as their clone bloodline allowed nearly half of them to be born with a life core. It was one of the reasons the Avalon House was so respected. The final group were those born with a composite affinity. It was nothing more than the combination of 2 elemental ones. The sound affinity the goblin had used was a result of air and lightning mana mixing. As for anything else, well, nobody had ever heard of a triple elemental affinity or a double rare affinity. In any case, Elaine nodded, letting him return to his practice. Percy willed the mana to gather in his hand once more, as he recalled the moment he used it against the goblin. It definitely did something. The blast hadn't left any visible injuries on the creature's body, but it had stopped it in its tracks for an abnormal amount of time. It had just stood still, waiting for Elaine to bisect it several seconds later. No sense in torturing myself thinking about it, I suppose. He'd already waited 15 years. He could wait another day. For now, he was better off just learning how to shape his magic. Bolt after bolt, he kept firing his mana randomly, working on both his cast time and potency. It wasn't until they rode up a hill that Elaine pulled him out of the trance again. "Percy! Look!" Lifting his eyes, he saw it. A colossal shadow stretched across the horizon. It was faintly obscured by a strange rosy mist, but there was no mistaking it. The Oracle Mountain. This was their destination. Or well, the temple located somewhere at its base was. The trio pressed on for another few hours, before setting camp at night. Elaine was visibly tense, hawking their surroundings as if her life depended on it. Percy chuckled at the sight. The grasslands could be more dangerous than the forest, as bandits typically roamed them, looking for easy targets. But not this close to the temple. According to Gawain, even the dumbest lowlifes knew not to provoke the affiliates of the Divine Order. His cousin didn't seem to know that, however. Her dad hadn't told her, probably still punishing her. Percy wouldn't interfere in their family matters. Looking back towards the mountain, he tried to make out the layer of mist surrounding it. But he couldn't see it. He knew it was still there, but it was invisible against the dark blanket of the night. He rubbed his hands in anticipation. Even though he'd never had the opportunity to travel much, he'd spent a lot of time in the house's library, reading all sorts of things about Remir and the upper echelons of the world. Those were the heights of magic he dreamt of reaching one day. The weirdly colored fog was one of his targets for the trip. Supposedly, it was a gift from the Titaness, Phoebe, the current leader of the Divine Order. Showering the mountain range, it trickled down the rocky slopes and accumulated at a basin, where it was used by the temple as fuel for the affinity test. Similar locations existed all around Remir. As far as he knew, the Order was interested in getting children evaluated early on, to fish out the talents among them, replenishing their ranks. But more importantly, Percy was interested in what the rosy mist was. Mind mana. And in just a few hours he would practically be bathing in it, swimming inside a sea of it, inhaling it with every breath. If this wasn't enough for his second core, he genuinely had no clue where to find a better source. He was almost tempted to jump on his horse and ride towards it right then and there, but he didn't feel like explaining to his cousin and uncle why he was so eager. It wasn't like the priests performed appraisals during the night. Plus, horseback was rather painful for him. In the end, he shrugged, resuming his practice as he formed a colorless blob of mana in his hand, squeezing it down into a transparent ball, about the size of a tangerine. He wasn't sure if he had improved at all. One typically needed weeks if not months of work before they noticed a difference. Not days. At least, he could train a lot more since his advancement. He was able to store more mana than before and to recover it much faster. Still, despite all his efforts, his status page had not bothered to register his magic. Apparently, he hadn't even crossed the threshold of a crude spell yet. Tell that to the goblin, rotting somewhere in the woods. Of course, Percy knew that if his magic hadn't registered yet, it probably meant he was using it incorrectly. It certainly didn't seem to have any physical effect, so he considered it might be mind mana. That would explain how the blast had disoriented the creature. But that didn't sound right. His colorless mana didn't look anything like the rosy mist surrounding the mountain. Ugh, 8 more hours, Percy. Just forget about it for 8 more hours. Chapter 6, Pilgrimage. Waiting in a queue must have been a novel experience for Elaine. There weren't that many people in their house. Being one of the chosen ones, she was generally given priority for most things. Strictly speaking, the same was true here. Just like everywhere else on Remir, Yellowborns always went first. Still, the sheer number of people waiting their turn was simply staggering. Even the lucky groups who had a Yellowborn among them easily numbered in the triple digits, which meant the trio would have to spend the better part of the morning in the line. Percy, on the other hand, was amazed he got to skip most of the wait for a change. He flashed the Orangeborns behind him an apologetic expression, not too comfortable cutting in line. It wasn't like he particularly minded waiting at the back either. For one, he was already used to such things by now. More importantly, this was perhaps the only time he wished he could stay here longer. Well, okay. He was naturally eager to find out his affinity, plus his legs were killing him. Elaine was propping him up right now, which wasn't exactly ideal. Still, he had another reason for taking his sweet time. Soon after entering the valley, he quickly verified his guess had been correct. Once the density of mind mana around him increased to the point where each breath carried with it a sliver of the rosy mist, he felt a part of his body stir. It wasn't his sternum, where his original core, everyone's core, was located. Instead, this was happening in his abdomen. He hadn't been able to examine his temporary alien body for long enough, but it seemed that's where the second mana core took root. Doesn't matter where it's located. In any case, he'd be happy to get one on his forehead if it meant giving him an edge. Hey. Fractured. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life and mind mana to germinate. The text in his status read the same, as his abdomen continued to suck the mind mana like a gluttonous vortex. Percy even made a conscious effort to take deeper, more frequent breaths. He didn't know if it would help, but it couldn't hurt. right? He had no idea how much mana the seed needed to germinate, although he hoped he would manage to collect enough by the time they had to leave. But he shook his head. This was too important to leave up to chance. I'm not going anywhere until it's done. If necessary, he'd make up some excuse to get Gawain to wait here for a couple more days. He knew his uncle wouldn't be thrilled, but if he told him his injuries were acting up, the man would listen. Maybe. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. Percy then looked around to pass the time. There were two types of people standing in the queue. Some wore finer clothes much like them. They were nobles of various houses, and he recognized many of their insignias, having stumbled upon them in his studies. All in all, there weren't too many prominent houses on Remir, only about 1,000. Each required a violet core at minimum to survive, and they didn't exactly grow on trees. Even Yellowborns had to guzzle down expensive elixirs for several centuries and survive countless assassination attempts to get to that point. Only 1% of them did. Baldy was one of those. The second group were dressed in simpler clothes, ranging from worn linen outfits to dirty rags. Those were the commoners. They rarely had a bloodline of their own, and even the few who had one didn't particularly stand out, as it was obviously not powerful enough to help them establish a house. Still, even the poorest commoner could give birth to a yellow-cored baby. And the Divine Order made sure that all the talented kids were given a chance to rise in the world. How nice of them, he sneered. Both the nobles and the peasants had a few things in common. First, every group escorted at least one toddler about 5 years old. Furthermore, all of those kids were orange-born at a minimum. Percy's was the only group who escorted a red-born teenager, earning him no small number of disdainful stares. Yeah, well, as annoying as it was, it made sense really. Phoebe was powerful, but she couldn't fill the whole world with mind mana. Instead, she mostly focused it on places such as this temple which administrated the more advanced test. Beyond that, she also mass-produced a lot of trinkets which smaller temples used for a more basic version of the test. Kids were typically brought to one of the minor sites at 5, where their status was awakened, and the grade of the core measured. From there, all the promising kids would be brought to temples like this by their parents to be tested further. It was possible for a Redborn to pay for an advanced test of course, but most of them didn't bother. After all, few had a rare affinity or a bloodline they couldn't identify on their own. Even fewer had the disposable income to waste on such a pointless endeavor. Well, unless you have rich parents who care enough to pay for you. Sadly, Percy was out of luck in that department too. First of all, both his parents had been Redborn like him. Secondly, they had both been killed along with most of the other Redborns of the family in a nasty attack from a rival house, only a couple years after his birth. He was only brought out of his thoughts when it was their turn to enter the temple. The structure looked even more grand from up close. It had a strange shape, its roof like a staircase of progressively smaller concentric rings, rising about 100 meters to the sky. Each of those steps were lined with rows of marble statues, depicting various men and women, their features more beautiful than any mortal he had ever seen. The figures were polished and immaculate, clearly enchanted to weather dust and rain alike. The gods of the Divine Order. Each of the temples supposedly depicted statues of every single god that had ever risen in the history of Remir. Apparently, whenever a new one emerged, another statue was added. Not that it happened often. The test is only free for Orangeborns and above, a male voice said. Percy looked at the guard who had just spoken. He was a tall blonde guy appearing to be in his late 20s, possessing a green core like his uncle. He wore a funny-looking toga and a pair of sandals, holding an intricate spear that looked more decorative than suited for combat, as did the other guard opposite him. The two had crossed their weapons, blocking the way to the tall golden gate of the temple. Naturally, said Gawain, handing him a heavy pouch filled with coins. The guard opened it to check its contents, allowing Percy to partially glimpse at their golden luster. He swallowed hard, realizing the test was even more expensive than he'd thought. If he hadn't convinced Baldy to subsidize him, gods knew how long he would have needed to pay his own way. A few steps into the temple, Elaine spoke. Dad, why do they charge so much for a simple test? Aren't they just making things difficult for Redborns? Gawain shook his head. Listen, Elaine, I know it seems unfair, but the Divine Order genuinely wants what's best for Remir. But then why? Isn't it best to help everyone figure out their affinity? In a perfect world, yes, but it takes a tremendous amount of mind mana to perform the test, and Redborns are 60% of the population. There just isn't enough for everyone. Percy, who was only partially listening to their conversation, felt cold sweat trickle down his back. Shit. I hope nobody realizes how much I've taken already. The density of the mist had already tripled by the time they reached the temple, but that wasn't even worth mentioning compared to the changes upon entering it. Inside, it was easily a dozen times thicker, to the point where they could barely watch where they stepped. And even worse, the seed in Percy's abdomen didn't seem to care about optics, only doubling its efforts to absorb it. By now, he could even see the mist spiral around his mouth if he paid close attention. He was forced to slow down his breaths, trying to hide what was happening. So focused was he on doing so, that he failed to notice when Gawain stopped walking, crashing into his uncle. Ouch, he said, rubbing his forehead. Felt more like he'd bumped into a wall than a person. Gawain tossed a glare his way to shut him up, when Percy realized they weren't alone. Chapter 7: The Most Ancient Art. A beautiful woman stood in front of them, dressed in elegant red clothes, wearing a tiara adorned with rubies on her head. Percy's mana sense revealed her core thrumming with an intimidating blue color, a grade higher than the two attendants by her side. The High Priestess didn't seem to mind his previous lack of attentiveness, flashing him a bright smile, before gesturing at another golden door. It was half as tall as the other one. Please enter the pool inside and extract some mana out of your core. The enchantments will take care of the rest. Percy frowned. Alone? Don't you have to, I don't know, supervise people? Gawain shook his head as the High Priestess tilted hers. Why? Are you planning to damage the sacred pool? She asked. No? I mean, definitely not. I just thought, isn't it too precious to leave unattended? She chuckled. I'm just messing with you. The evaluation is a private affair. Nobody can force you to disclose the results against your will. As for the integrity of the pool, you don't need to worry about it. Even I can't put a scratch on the materials, and nobody below Violet could possibly snatch any of the concentrated mana in there. I guess we'll see about that. Outwardly, he only nodded before limping towards the door. Do you need somebody to accompany you? The High Priestess asked again as she saw his injuries, but he shook his head, cupping his fists politely. He really didn't want anybody watching. Whatever was about to go down in there. He rushed forward, as quickly as he could manage, wincing with every step. Luckily, nobody seemed to notice anything was off. It was probably normal for those undertaking the test to be excited. It was a significant turning point in their lives after all. However, that wasn't what Percy was thinking. He was holding his breath, trying to mask the suspicious flow of mist. As soon as the golden doors closed behind him, he looked at the only thing in the room. It was a circular basin with a diameter of about 20 feet, filled to the brim with a dense red liquid that looked a bit like glowing blood. The liquid made a crisp sound, rippling as something fell in the middle of the pool. Looking up, Percy saw the mist swirl and gather at the ceiling. A decorated stalactite-like structure appeared to collect and condense it. Its edge was shaped like the beak of a large bird, as a droplet enlarged, held in the tiny gap between its 2 points. Once it grew large enough, it fell, sending another ripple. Cool. I hope it still looks like this after I'm done with it, he thought as he undressed. Sadly, that was nothing but wishful thinking. Not even a moment after he dipped his toes into the pool, all hell broke loose. The seed in his abdomen didn't bother waiting for him to inhale the mist anymore. A violent suction force emerged from his belly, directly causing the liquid to flow up his skin, making its way to it. Percy panicked. The commotion could easily draw the attention of the High Priestess. He tried to step back, but his foot was stuck in the flowing liquid. He put more strength, trying to extricate his body, causing the red material to stretch like rubber, before snapping back, pulling him into the pool. The sound was muted, as the fluid was already coiling around him. I can't breathe. Not only was it traveling up and through his skin, but also down his throat. Percy used all his strength to stand up. It was hard, and it took him several seconds to right himself. Even when he did, he couldn't bring his head out of the liquid, as he was covered from top to bottom like a crimson snowman. He tried to claw the material out of his face, but it didn't help. More kept flowing to replace it. Dizzy, he fell to his knees, his consciousness slipping. Percy thought he was a goner, when the flow suddenly eased up. It quickly lost its viscosity, falling back into the pool, trickling down his skin. But he wasn't out of the woods just yet. His second core was clearly a sloppy eater, having failed to clean up after its mess. The liquid outside his body had stopped hugging him, but that didn't help with the part still in his lungs. Percy desperately hit his chest, trying to cough the substance out, with limited success. No, I can't drown during the dam test. That would be such a dumb way to die. Thinking of something, he climbed out of the pool, feeling an attractive force tugging at the liquid in his lungs. The High Priestess wasn't kidding when she said nobody could steal it from this place. He opened his mouth, letting it flow out, but it was still slow and he was running out of time. Suddenly, he had another bright idea. Reaching for the mana inside his first core, he followed the High Priestess's instructions, beginning the assessment in earnest. This was what he was actually here for after all. Soon, a few runes lit up on the walls and on the floor of the room, as the volume of the liquid still in his lungs began to decrease and the mana in his core to drain. The taste of air was so sweet when he could finally breathe properly again, though he didn't get to enjoy it for very long, as somebody knocked repeatedly on the door, breaking him out of his thoughts. What's taking so long? Are you okay in there? A female voice asked. Percy didn't recognize it. He guessed she was one of the attendants. Yeah, everything is fine. Sorry. It took me a while to figure it out. The voice remained silent for a couple of seconds. Percy wasn't sure if she had bought his lousy excuse or if she was still trying to process it. Well, it was the latter. What's there to figure out? Please tell me you haven't pissed inside the sacred pool, she yelled again, this time a hint of anger seeping through. He scratched his head, unsure what to say. What? Of course not. Who do you take me for? Was what he ended up going with. Next, he took another look at the pool. Its surface was a couple feet deeper than before. Evidently, he'd already drained about a third of the volume. I'm afraid you'll wish I'd only pissed in it. He chuckled awkwardly. Then he raised an eyebrow. I mean, it would raise the water level again. But he shook his head. He had desecrated the holy goo enough for a day. Next, he picked up his clothes, pulling up his status as he dressed. Maybe he should have waited until he was safely out of this place before worrying about it, but he figured he might as well check it now in case they murdered him and he never got the chance. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange. Soul. Mana core 2. Seed.
Ew.
Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity.
Ew. Hey.
Grants access to your status.
Hey.
Grants a bloodline.
Hey.
Incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Success. The changes were small but important. Not only had he finally learned he possessed the soul affinity, but the trait granting him the second mana core had graduated from fractured to incomplete. It now only needed life mana, which meant Percy was merely a step away. Now he just had to make it out of the temple in one piece. Exiting the room, he found all 5 people giving him strange looks. What? I'm injured, it took me ages to undress. He shrugged. The attendants eyed him suspiciously, but luckily the person who had the final word, the High Priestess, didn't dwell on it. All right, I trust everything went well then? She asked. Percy nodded. Great. As I said before, you don't have to disclose your affinity if you don't want to. Still, if you are willing to share it, we can give you some basic guidance. Hearing that, he raised an eyebrow. It was indeed a tempting offer. A soul affinity was even rarer than others, and he doubted he could learn much from the library. He opened his mouth to speak, when one of the attendants beat him to it. Mother! He's already wasted more than enough time. Percy recognized the voice as the one that had spoken to him earlier. Arathea. The High Priestess said in a stern tone. Basic guidance is a part of the service. The attendant gritted her teeth. But he's just a Redborn. There are hundreds of kids waiting outside. She protested. The second attendant didn't say anything, but Percy guessed he agreed with his colleague based on his expression. Luckily for Percy, the High Priestess didn't. And that's why he had to pay a hefty sum to be tested. Now that he deserves the same treatment as everyone else. Her daughter or subordinate or whatever Arathea was, clearly didn't like the response. Storming off to the room he just exited. Damn. I hope she can't tell the difference. Though the High Priestess didn't seem to pay her any heed. She turned to him, evidently still waiting for his answer. Percy looked at his uncle, wondering if it would be okay to reveal this information. After all, depending on how things went, it could easily become a secret of House Avalon. Go on. The High Priestess can be trusted, Gawain said. He nodded at his uncle before speaking. Yes, some guidance sounds peachy. I have a soul affinity. Everyone seems surprised to hear that. Interesting, the High Priestess said before turning to Gawain. And I take it Archibald wouldn't have sent him here if he hadn't inherited the bloodline too. Is House Avalon about to develop a new branch? That is very much our patriarch's hope, Gawain said. Percy was surprised his uncle hadn't hesitated for even a moment before replying. He couldn't tell if he knew her personally, or if all the order's clergy deserved such trust. She seemed ready to offer a few words of advice, when a shriek came out of the room. A moment later, the gates slammed open, Arathea storming out, her face red like a ripe tomato. What did you do? She grabbed Percy by the collar, shaking him like a doll. The High Priestess grabbed her wrist to calm her down, but didn't speak, only flashing her a questioning gaze. Half the condensed mana is gone, Arathea yelled, causing everyone's faces to fall. They all looked at Percy, demanding an explanation. Knowing he didn't exactly have that many options, Percy swallowed hard, before falling back to the most ancient art invented by mankind. I found it like that. Chapter 8 Soul. Percy and his relatives barely managed to escape with their lives, leaping out of the wolves' den by the skin of their teeth. Okay, maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration. The High Priestess let them go, relatively easily. Not that Percy's hastily constructed lie was particularly believable, but at the end of the day there wasn't any evidence incriminating him. After all, she had said it herself. Nobody below Violet could steal the dense mind mana, let alone an orange-cored teenager. While she had certainly seemed somewhat colder during their subsequent interactions, in the end she did give him some tips on how to train with his affinity like she had promised. That was why he was squinting really hard right now, trying to peer into Elaine's soul. Cut it out, will you? She grunted in annoyance. What did you even do in there? I tested for my affinity, he shrugged. His cousin rolled her eyes. Fine, keep your secrets. Just try not to get us all killed next time. Percy was about to comment on the irony of her statement, but in the end, he chose to let it slide. He was too busy to walk into another argument. The High Priestess had explained that the soul affinity could be used for offense. Even though it wasn't good at affecting physical objects, there were ways to shape it into a potent weapon against living things. What he had done to that goblin was proof enough it was possible, but it still didn't explain why Percy was so bad at it. After all, even a red core could easily injure somebody with a fireball or a stone shard. Why had he needed to advance to orange before he could stun a single goblin temporarily? Hearing his worries, she had advised him to start by developing something called a soul vision. Simply put, it was just a specialized version of the basic mana sense that everyone had upon awakening their core. Soul vision made use of his affinity to observe another's soul directly. Once he managed to pull that off, he could more easily understand what he had been doing wrong with his magic. The trio finally made it to their horses, much to Percy's relief. As painful as riding was, it was several times better than walking. Only after they headed off did he resume training, willing the soul mana to build up in his eyes. This time, he focused on his uncle, to avoid his cousin's complaints. Getting some rudimentary version of soul vision to work wasn't too difficult. Even the slightest trickle of mana allowed him to see things he couldn't previously. The main challenge was fine-tuning the process, to make this new sense of his as effective as possible. If he used too little mana, Gawain's soul was barely visible, appearing as a few faint wisps of silver swirling around his chest. Using more than necessary, on the other hand, was like pulling wool in front of his eyes, as the excess soul mana itself obscured his sight. The trick was to get used to exactly the right amount, so that he could discern his uncle's soul without obstructing it. He knew it was just a matter of practice until he nailed it, but he did hope he could get it done by the time they returned to the Whistling Woods. He would need it for the next part of his training after all. Better make the next 3 days count then. Just a little more. Percy sent another clump of mana to his right eye. As that happened, Gawain's soul came into focus, letting his nephew spy on it more clearly. To Percy, human souls appeared like semi-amorphous flames contained inside one's body, spreading to roughly cover its entire volume. They did flicker a bit, so their shape constantly diverged from that of the person's flesh. Also, he had no idea what happened to somebody's soul after they died. Still, this was good progress in his book. And the best part was that he only needed a few seconds to fine-tune his soul vision by now. Not to say there wasn't any room for improvement though. Percy breathed hard as the mana dispersed from his eyes, returning his sight to normal. Sadly, he couldn't keep his new trick up for too long before having to stop. It took quite a mental toll, plus it did cost a fair amount of mana to maintain. That said, he figured both would improve over time. Perhaps, one day he would even be able to keep soul vision up indefinitely, although that was more of a long-term project. It'll do for now. He looked up, at the rows of pine trees appearing in the distance. He had trained relentlessly over the last 3 days and luckily, it had paid off. He had managed to get his soul vision to an acceptable level by the time they returned to the forest. It took some begging, but he had convinced Gawain to help him find some more goblins to practice on, now that he finally had the tool to figure out what was going on. His uncle had initially been resistant to the idea, but he'd eventually relented. Percy wasn't sure if the man had warmed up to him, or if he was doing this because his daughter had asked him to. The young man appreciated it all the same. Just remember, we won't spend more than a week here, Gawain reminded him. Have I mentioned you're my favorite uncle? Percy asked. We both know that's a low bar. Gawain rolled his eyes. And you've passed it with flying colors. Percy didn't let up. So, it turned out wood goblins were a lot tougher to find when one was actively looking for them. Well, either that or the trio had just been unlucky last week. In any case, it took them 6 full days to find one this time around. And that's only because they stumbled across an injured loner abandoned by its pack. Percy would have liked to put the poor thing out of its misery. But truth be told, the creature's misery was only about to begin. He did feel a little bad doing this, but he had to test his soul magic on something. Inanimate objects obviously wouldn't work, which left humans, innocent animals, or ugly goblins. And sadly, Percy's green pal was the most disposable of those targets. Don't look at me like that. I'll start easy. He told the creature tied to a tree. Activating soul vision, he spent a few moments calibrating it, as the goblin's soul came into focus. It looked disturbingly similar to his uncle's, only slightly shorter. Percy didn't know if goblin souls were fundamentally different to those of humans, or if they only looked smaller due to having less space to expand to. Judging from how I managed to possess an alien body, I suppose souls of different species are somewhat interchangeable. Or maybe not. His clone had fallen apart rather quickly, but he shook the philosophical thoughts out of his head. He couldn't keep his soul vision up for too long, so he had to make it count. Pulling some more soul mana out of his core, this time he gathered it in his palm. Normally, it appeared colorless, to the point he could barely see it with the naked eye. Not now. Through soul vision, it appeared like a bright silver orb, about the size of a cherry. Soon, he fired the bolt towards the goblin, carefully paying attention to the changes. As the projectile slammed into the similarly colored silhouette of the creature, he saw it bend backwards and distort, its shape clearly rattled. Dispersing the mana in his eyes, he watched the goblin's physical form, curious to see what would happen to it. Percy's prisoner looked disoriented for a while, but its eyes regained their focus after a few seconds. He nodded. He'd held back with the last attack, partly to conserve his mana and partly to avoid dealing permanent damage to the creature too early. The last blast had only been at the level of what a red core would be capable of. Next, he repeated the process, this time charging the orb as long as possible, letting it reach the size of a tangerine before shooting it at the creature. The impact was a lot more violent than before, causing the goblin's soul to stretch, almost leaving its body. Then, it snapped back, shaking intensely for a few seconds, like a boat trapped in a storm. Still, it settled down eventually, without any permanent damage visible on the surface. Percy switched to his regular vision and observed the changes to the goblin. This time it remained out of it for longer than an hour, before eventually regaining its senses. It still appeared somewhat dizzy afterwards, but it didn't look like something a few hours of sleep couldn't fix. As I thought, my attacks barely do anything. Any other affinity I know of would be deadly at orange. He frowned, trying to work a way around the issue. The problem was that the goblin's soul was surprisingly resilient. And judging from his experiences growing up, human souls were even more so. Anyone he'd ever tossed his mana against had shrugged it off without feeling more than a simple chill. Thinking back to his attacks, it was a bit like trying to punch a sandbag. No matter how much strength he put behind the blast, it would just deform to absorb it. A sandbag, huh? Percy willed his mana to gather in his hand again. This time, rather than shaping it into a ball, he focused it on his index and middle fingers, trying to make it as pointy as possible. This was his first attempt at something like that, so it took a while. The construct crumbled a few times, and he couldn't make it too sharp without it falling apart. But eventually he managed to get something about as pointy as a spoon's handle. He activated Soul Vision once more as he walked up to the goblin. As much as he would have liked to throw the new projectile, he knew it wouldn't survive the flight. He pointed his augmented fingers towards the goblin's chest and stabbed forward. His actual fingers stopped on the creature's skin, but the surrounding mana dug an inch deeper. H! The goblin shrieked loudly, the sheer agony contained in its voice making Percy's hair stand on end. Covering his ears, he took a few steps back, but kept his soul vision active, trying to figure out what was going on. There was a small scar on the creature's soul. It was tiny, as if it had been nicked by a fingernail, but unlike the blunt damage from before, it wasn't recovering. Percy didn't know if it would, given enough time, but he could tell the goblin would be in a world of pain until then. The creature's cries instantly reminded him of his experience possessing the alien body. What the goblin was feeling right now appeared to be similar to what he'd felt back when his clone fell apart. Maybe not quite as intense, but of a similar sort. He turned around just in time to catch Elaine heaving out her lunch, her father looking at her with concern. The two had been observing him during his experiments, also curious about his soul affinity. Percy walked back to the goblin. Even though the little buggers had shot him full of holes just days ago, watching the creature squirm churned up his own stomach. Besides, he'd learned more than enough to plan out the next phase of his training. Pulling a knife out, he plunged it into the goblin's neck, putting an end to its suffering. A soul affinity, huh? Clearly not meant for the faint of heart. Elaine helped Percy walk as they passed through the corridor leading to Baldy's office. She hadn't spoken to him much during the last stretch of their journey, still shaken after watching him torture the goblin. He didn't think she held it against him or anything. Hell, he'd watched her butcher plenty of goblins herself just days ago. Still, she'd kept her distance from him every time he practiced since then, clearly having some newfound appreciation for the danger his affinity posed. And he didn't exactly blame her for it. Who would have thought such a small cut on one's soul would cause such suffering? Truth be told, his mood hadn't been much better, but that didn't mean he could take a day off training. Those at the bottom of the ladder didn't have the luxury to stop climbing. Whenever they did, the rising tide drowned them. Consequently, he'd spent the last few hours of their trip honing his projectiles into knives. They already looked much better than what he had stabbed the goblin with, and he could even throw them a short distance before they crumbled. Though they weren't ready for combat. Not yet, at least. Reaching the office, they knocked a couple of times. Gomain. The two entered, finding their grandpa much like they had left him. Does he even sleep? Or has he spent the past 2 weeks in that seat? Thanks, Elaine. You may go. Percy wasn't sure why his grandpa wanted to speak with him alone. Even stranger was how Elaine did as she was told, leaving the room without any protest. What's up with her today? Surely she's not just scared of my affinity? He shook his head. He would talk to her later, but for now he had to figure out how to snatch Baldy's magic tree. Come closer. His grandpa spoke. He frowned, but ultimately obliged, curious to see what the man wanted. Archibald placed a hand on Percy's shoulder, as the latter felt a suffocating pressure emerge from the former's sternum. Activating his mana sense, he saw a bright violet star thrum with activity in his grandpa's chest, as a film of vibrant green covered the man's arm in his regular vision. Percy instinctively tried to step back as he saw the life mana flow towards him, still not completely over the trauma from the temple, but Archibald's firm grip kept him in place. As the mana trickled down his body, the seed of his second core awakened once more, trying to pull it, making Percy fear the worst. He didn't think his grandpa had enough mana to suffocate him, nor was it nearly dense enough to do so, but the man could still notice something was off. Luckily, that didn't happen. Unlike the red liquid that had been kept in the pool for Phoebe knew how long, Baldy's mana was filled with his intent, rendering Percy's second core powerless to affect it. Ignoring the weak pull, the green river continued past his abdomen, reaching his legs, as Percy felt his wounds itch. And just a moment later, it was over. Archibald let go of him, as Percy tried moving his feet, finding not only the pain but even the soreness from the trip gone. He almost thanked his grandpa. He wasn't used to receiving much from him, but this was the second time in a few days. First, the hefty sum Baldy had spent for his affinity test. Now this, not that it seemed to take much effort to heal him, but it would save Percy weeks of annoyance all the same. Still, he bit his tongue. Archibald had only begun to give him stuff upon learning there was value in him. It was all a transaction. "It's a handy trick," is what he said in the end. Baldy nodded, looking at him silently for a few seconds. "My son told me you have the soul affinity. Is there anything more I can help you with?" Percy suppressed a chuckle. "Sure. I'll take all the mana from your magic tree, killing it in the process. Then I want twice as many elixirs as you give any of the others, to feed both of my mana cores. I'll let you know if there's anything else." Naturally, he kept those thoughts to himself. "No," he said. "I'll practice with my soul mana on my own for a few days and then I'll test clone again." Maybe his grandpa could offer a few words of advice, but it wouldn't amount to much. Percy was pretty much in uncharted territory. He would have to figure out how his bloodline interacted with his affinity by himself. Hopefully his new soul vision would help with that. "Very well," Percy nodded as well, walking out of the office. The young man looked at the tall oak tree, which honestly resembled a jade statue more than a plant. It exuded a thick green mist, reminding him of the mana around the temple. But it smelled nice. The mind mana had been odorless, while this gave each breath a fresh minty undertone. It had taken him about a week of planning to figure out how to make it here. Baldy clearly went above and beyond to keep it safe. It obviously hadn't been planted in the garden outside, as anybody could steal or damage it there. Instead, he had carved out a special location inside the mansion, for an inner garden. It was designed to only have a single entrance. Luckily, it had been several decades since the last time anybody tried anything funny, so some chinks had appeared in the tight security. From there, Percy only had to wait for his uncles Gareth and Balin to be paired on the same shift, which took a few days longer than he had hoped, but did happen eventually. The two idiots were among the laziest in the family, so they often left their post a few minutes earlier than they were meant to. No time to waste then. Percy approached the tree, already feeling the seed in his abdomen beginning to draw in the mana. Standing next to the trunk, he stretched his hand, but paused just an inch from it. Once he started, there was no going back. If this was anything like what had happened during the affinity test, he wouldn't be able to stop until his second core was satisfied. And Percy wasn't sure the tree even contained enough for that. It had a lot, but could it compare to the condensed mana of a Titanus? One thing was certain though, whether it was enough or not, the tree wouldn't survive. Based on what he'd heard, this tree was actually a treasure gifted to his family by the Divine Order. It was a great help for life users honing their spells. Even his grandpa regularly used it. They were actually lucky none of the white cores leading the great houses had a life affinity. Otherwise they would have long destroyed House Avalon to seize the tree by force. If Percy ruined it here, he'd be dealing a severe blow to his own family. Even if he managed to escape their wrath, all his relatives might end up dying a few years from now, crushed by a rival house. All because of him. Why the hell should I care? They certainly didn't care about him. Percy needed to awaken his second core if he was to ever be more than cannon fodder. It's not like he had a choice. Did he? He gritted his teeth. He had to do this. He had to. Percy entered his grandpa's office, not bothering to knock. His fists were clenched tightly, drained of all color. He had been so close last night, just a tap away from completing his new core. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Even now he wasn't sure why. Archibald raised an eyebrow at his grandson's intrusion, though he didn't say anything, waiting for him to speak first. "I want the jade tree. It won't survive," Percy said, fully expecting Baldy to laugh him out of the room. At best, he didn't really think there was a chance Baldy would agree. Still, he didn't dare to steal it, so asking for it was the only path left. Contrary to his expectations, however, his grandpa wasn't outraged. He didn't laugh at him either. Instead, his response shocked Percy even more. "I figured out that much." Taken aback, the young man stared at him in confusion, before Baldy gestured at a chair across him. "How?" Percy asked upon sitting. "Gawain told me what happened at the temple. You think he didn't notice how the mind mana was swirling around you? My daughter did too. You're lucky her attendants didn't. Otherwise she wouldn't have managed to cover your ass." "Your daughter? The High Priestess?" Percy asked. Archibald nodded. "She's your aunt, Guinevere. She's only a few years older than Gawain, but she's a Yellowborn. I thought you needed as many Yellowborns as possible to increase the chances of getting more Violet cores for the family. Why would you send her away? We do need every Yellowborn we can get." Archibald sighed. "Even then, there's no guarantee one will be ready to succeed me if I die. But having strong ties to the Divine Order is just as important." Well, this was all fascinating, but Percy had more pressing concerns at the moment. "That still doesn't explain how you knew I needed life mana." Baldy chuckled. "Please, I'm 50 times your age. You think I wouldn't notice you trying to snatch my own mana right in front of me?" Percy smiled awkwardly. He really was out of his depth here. "I still have no clue what you needed all the mind mana for, but as soon as I healed you, I knew you weren't done. I paid closer attention to you since, and you didn't disappoint. The young man fell back weakly, letting his neck sink into the silky headrest as he stared up at the ceiling. He had been so foolish to think he could outsmart the old fox. Why are we even having this conversation then? Just execute me, or banish me, or whatever. Baldy fell back as well, his own expression morphing into something Percy didn't quite recognize. His grandpa almost looked sad, but he'd never seen him like that, so he wasn't sure. Percy, do you hate our family? The young man frowned. Where was this coming from all of a sudden? His first thought was to reply, obviously, but he figured he could take his time answering. Most of the people in his house were, frankly, assholes, present company included. But then there was Elaine who he got along with, and his parents who he didn't really remember. Was it fair to hate his parents, just because of their surname, without even knowing them? Hell, he was part of the family too. Did he hate himself? Perhaps it was its management he hated. His grandpa. But the man was pragmatic and honestly not a bad leader. His decisions were always calculated. Even though I always get the short end of the math. Still, it wasn't like he never got anything from them. At least he had food and a roof over his head. He even had his own room. But so what? Was he supposed to just forget everything else? To forgive them? To love them? I don't know, he said after a long time. Archibald nodded again. Here's an easier one then. Do you resent me? Chapter 10 Archibald. Who is asking? The head of the family? Or my grandpa? Does it matter? Baldy asked. Percy shrugged. Percy, I am the third head of the house. I've been in charge for less than 200 years. Our family has existed for nearly 10 times as long. This wasn't exactly news to the young man. He had read about the family's history, so he just waited to see what the man was getting at. I'm sure you knew most of that already, but what you might have not read about in your books was that the second head, my great-grandpa, died about 20 years before I advanced to Violet. Percy swallowed a mouthful of saliva. On Remier, a noble house without a Violet core at the helm was like a tasty meal lying on the ground. He could imagine all the alliances, conflicts, and betrayals that must have happened during those 2 decades. They had probably been some of his family's darkest years. Why are you telling me this? I want you to appreciate how precarious our situation is, how it has always been. Out of the 1,000 Violet cores on Remier, how many do you think will make it to White? You tell me. 20? 50? Percy threw a guess. Archibald chuckled bitterly. We'll be lucky if 1 or 2 do. The rest are mostly hoping they can get another Violet in their family before they die. Otherwise they're screwed. Every time I make a choice, every time I allocate resources, it can make the difference between our house surviving or dying out. This time Percy lost his patience. Look, I get it. You don't have to explain that at this late stage. But why couldn't you just treat me like a grandson? Archibald's eyes wavered for a moment. Who would have thought that emotionless prick could even feel things? Because it's easier that way, he sighed. Have you any idea how many people I've buried? Uncles, brothers, cousins, children, grandchildren. The less attached I am, the more impartial I can be. His voice was soft. It cracked many times, as the powerful Violet core struggled to form his words. Percy truly looked at his grandpa for the first time. What was he even supposed to say to that? Now, will you tell me what you need all that mana for? Archibald asked. Percy smiled. It wasn't like their brief chat could magically erase a lifetime of bitterness. But he saw no point in hiding the truth either. Remember how I said my version of clone did something interesting? I may have undersold how interesting it was. He chuckled before elaborating. I didn't understand it at the time, but I believe it allowed me to send a fragment of my soul to possess somebody outside Remier. Somebody with 2 cores. He added after a second. Archibald's eyebrows would have hit the ceiling if they weren't attached to his face. The Moirai! He exclaimed. Ah, right. I knew it was moi something. In any case, my clone brought back whatever it is that gives them their second core, although it was broken and it needed fixing. Archibald remained silent for a few minutes. Percy didn't rush him either. And how close are you to fixing it? He eventually asked. If the jade tree has enough mana, 5 minutes. The young man replied. Archibald nodded. Wait, what? Are you actually giving me the tree? Just like that? Percy couldn't conceal the shock in his voice. Baldy looked him in the eyes before replying. Absolutely not. Percy would have strangled him if he could. Why was he playing with his feelings like that? Yet Archibald wasn't done. Listen, Percy, he said in a serious tone. A human having 2 cores is unheard of. And who knows what else you can get through your bloodline. Even though it might not be enough to bridge the gap between you and an Orangeborn right now, I'm willing to invest in your potential. From now on, you will have access to the advanced elixirs. The young man's heart, if it was 1 month ago, he would be jumping up and down. However, there were other things he wanted more now. But I can't even use my second core without the tree. I can't give up the tree on a gamble. Let alone you, even if it was Elaine having a second core, I couldn't do that. The tree might help me protect our family next year. Your second core might need centuries to pay off if it ever does. Percy deflated as he listened to his grandpa. Still, he couldn't argue with his logic. But that doesn't mean we're giving up on it either. Baldy added, rekindling a spark of hope in his grandson's eyes. I will get you a different source of life mana. Percy reluctantly opened his eyes, not fully awake yet. He was tempted to tell his visitor to piss off whoever it was, but he didn't. Few people ever wanted anything from him, so it could be important. Getting up, he yawned, slowing, making his way to the door. On the way, he glanced out the window. It was still dark. What's so urgent it couldn't wait a couple more hours? Turning the handle, he pulled the door open, seeing nobody but his grandpa standing at the entrance. Percy blinked a couple of times. Then he massaged his eyelids. Baldy was still there when he was done. The realization jolted the last traces of sleep out of the young man's system. You brought it. The life source. Archibald wasn't holding anything. Percy looked behind him, trying to see if there was an attendant carrying something. Yet the corridor was empty, other than his grandpa who was dressed in his training robes. Are you done? The man asked in irritation. May I come in? Percy shrugged, making way for him. He gestured towards his bed as he didn't have any other furniture to offer. Archibald sat there, patting the space next to him. The young man joined his grandfather, still curious to see what he wanted. We don't have any other potent life treasures in the family, Baldy said. Percy was about to voice a protest, but Archibald stopped him, patting his shoulder. Instead, I'll be your life source. Then, he repeated his actions from last week, sending the potent mana in his grandson's body. Only this time, he didn't target Percy's legs, but directly focused it on the young man's abdomen, relinquishing control over it as the seed absorbed it. Percy creased his forehead. Truth be told, his feelings were mixed. Stingy old man. If he didn't want to give me the tree, he should have just left it at that. What do I make of this? It wasn't like he didn't appreciate the elixirs and this gesture. That was a lot more than he'd ever expected from his grandpa. Still, how would it help him? Not that Archibald was weak. Not even close. A violet core was 4 grades above orange. This meant the man possessed about 81 times as much mana as him. The gap was insane. But far from enough. Forget about the liquid in the sacred pool. That was the concentrated mana of a Titanus. Even the tree contained within it countless times more than his grandpa's core. In fact, Archibald would be hard-pressed to produce as much mana as a single leaf. And sure enough, 5 minutes later Baldy was completely tapped out, breathing heavily. Had this been before their meeting, Percy might have voiced a snarky comment, but right now he wasn't in the mood. Thanks, he said. For trying, at least. Archibald gave him a strange look as the corner of his lips twitched. Huh? How little do you think of me? You think I'm trying to cheat you out of our deal? He chuckled. Of course I can't match Phoebe's pinky toe in mana capacity, but that's only if we compete fairly, he said. But what if I keep emptying and refilling my core? 10 times? 100 times? 1,000 times? Baldy flashed his grandson a resolute look. Percy, I'll repair your second core no matter how long it takes. Chapter 11 Cracks. Percy sat on his bed, next to his grandpa. It had been 2 weeks since Baldy started filling his second core. Sadly, they didn't have anything to show for it yet. Not even a hint they were getting closer. Still, the young man was feeling some newfound appreciation for his grandpa. Not only because he was practically showering him with affection for the first time in his life, but also due to his sheer dedication and discipline. Frankly, the man was a monster. Every day, he showed up before sunrise, and didn't leave his room until hours past sunset. Well, besides a few mandatory breaks, of course. I guess you don't reach Violet by accident. Having delegated the family's management to his sons and daughters, Baldy didn't slack at all. It took him nearly 5 minutes to empty his core and about 20 to refill it. He spent over 18 hours per day in Percy's room, and the young man once counted a total of 42 refills. Percy had almost expected him to give up after the first week, but Archibald showed no intention of doing that. Pressing on, he seemed determined to follow his words through to the end. And watching him work hard, Percy was also motivated to keep his training up. For the first few days, he'd continued honing the sharpness and integrity of his constructs. When he began experiencing diminishing returns, he switched to increasing their range. That said, his room wasn't that large, so he had to stop when they reached the walls. Naturally, his soul mana could phase through, but he didn't want to hit somebody on the other side by accident. However, the weirdest thing was how his grandpa had started talking to him since the second day. In hindsight, it shouldn't have surprised Percy. After all, the two would be stuck spending all their time together for who knew how long. It would be stranger if they never talked. Still, he wasn't used to casual chats with Baldy, the two having limited their past interactions to the bare minimum. As for what they talked about, well, at first his grandpa offered him tips and guidance on how to better manipulate and recover his mana. A few days later, however, they graduated to more idle chatter, even gossiping about Percy's aunts and uncles, or teaching the young man about the other families on Remir. Stuff he couldn't find in books. Percy knew the man was overcompensating, largely because of the harsh things he had spoken during their meeting, but he didn't say anything to stop it. It was embarrassing to admit, but this felt nice. He formed the daggers in his hand for the billionth time. They didn't look very elegant. Their shape was irregular, closer to sharpened stones than finely crafted knives. Percy wouldn't be winning any art competition with them, that was for sure. Still, they were sturdy, and he was confident they would be useful in a fight. Having reached an acceptable shape and range, he'd even learned to produce 2 of them with each hand at once. Today, he was planning to try forming a third, when his grandpa suggested something different. Maybe you should figure out how your bloodline works. Percy knew he was right. Creating that soul clone had been the greatest turning point in his life. If it hadn't been for that, he might have never found out his affinity or gained access to better elixirs. He certainly wouldn't have a second core to work towards, and he might have never gotten to know his grandpa better. And that was just the start. How many more mysteries lied out there in the cosmos? What else could he bring back to Remir? I suppose I should stop postponing it then. The reason he'd been so hesitant was because he wasn't keen on experiencing the agony of splitting his soul again. Frankly, it was something he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. Yet, it was the only way forward. He activated soul vision, this time glancing down at his own soul. After all, that was the starting point for everything else. A sea of silver blinded him, causing him to shut his eyes. He reduced the concentration of mana before opening them again. Fine-tuning the ability to work at such a close distance took him about an hour. This was because he also wanted more detail than he usually got to more closely examine his soul. As the flame underneath his flesh came into focus, Percy's eyes widened. For the most part, it was similar to every other he had looked at. However, there was one important difference which sent shivers down his spine. The semi-amorphous silhouette flowing under his skin was covered in countless cracks. Each was far narrower than the one he had inflicted on the goblin, their thickness akin to a hair's. However, they were many times longer, one even stretching across his entire forearm. His soul was like a broken vase, held together by spit and wishes. "Is everything all right?" Archibald asked in concern. Percy explained the situation. "I see. You must have really messed your soul up. It's lucky you survived." The young man nodded, his expression grim. "What now? Do souls recover over time?" he asked. He didn't even know why it didn't hurt right now. Maybe it was because the cracks were too narrow, or perhaps it was all relative. Experiencing his soul clone crumbling apart might have raised his tolerance to the point his current state didn't bother him. Either way, he wouldn't risk using his bloodline like this. For the time being, I suggest you observe your soul for a few days to see if it can heal by itself. Also, check if you can speed up the process with your mana." Another 2 weeks passed by in a flash. During this time, Archibald had continued pouring mana into his grandson's abdomen, with no end in sight. Calculating everything, he should have already passed 1,000 refills a while ago, but the seed showed no signs of being satiated. Luckily, Percy had found more success with regards to his cracked soul. Fortunately, it turned out it did recover by itself, albeit slowly. Adding the weeks before he began observing it, Percy estimated it would have needed a total of about 3 months to fully recover. Even better, focusing his soul mana on the wounds had proven exceptionally effective, accelerating the process threefold. In a couple more days, it should be as good as new. It's a pity it hurts so much. Indeed, the only downside was that this approach seemed to agitate the injuries. It was a bit like rubbing salt in a wound, only 100 times worse. Suffice to say, the last couple of weeks had been far from pleasant. Still, it was a small price to pay if it meant he could use his bloodline again that much sooner. "Next time you shouldn't activate it randomly," his grandpa said. Percy frowned. "Well, how else am I supposed to do it?" Baldy appeared to think for a few minutes before replying. "I can't tell you that. The bloodline works differently in your case. Nobody but you can answer that question. However, what I can do is to give you some inspiration. Tomorrow, I'll take a break from pouring mana into your core." "Why?" Percy asked. "I'll need it for something else. I'm going to demonstrate our family's most fundamental technique. It has been passed down and refined for over 1,700 years. "You mean?" Archibald nodded. "I'm going to show you how to efficiently cultivate a life clone." Chapter 12 Clone. Percy opened the door, finding his grandpa outside as usual. This time, however, Baldy wasn't alone. He was accompanied by somebody who looked almost identical to him, like a twin brother. The only differences to the naked eye were that the second Baldy wore different robes and had a vacant expression. Percy made way for the two to enter, but his grandpa shook his head. Instead, he gestured for the young man to follow him to the garden. As soon as they reached the training grounds, Baldy and his clone stopped at the same time, which looked a bit creepy. "What do you know about the clone bloodline?" Archibald asked. "The normal version, I mean." Percy dug through his memories for all the information about the ability. Truth be told, his understanding of it was quite comprehensive. After all, it wasn't exactly a great secret that his family had it. Plus, his cousins never stopped boasting about it. "They take a while to make, but that decreases with one's grade, so I suppose it should be much faster for you. The clones can't think for themselves and they can't even use magic, but they can be given simple commands. Supposedly, they make great laborers." Baldy nodded. "That's the gist of it, but there are a few more key points to consider. First, use your other senses to examine it." Following his grandpa's instructions, Percy activated Mana Sense. While there was some life mana flowing through the clone's body, it didn't have a core whatsoever. There was nothing but a slightly denser concentration of mana in its sternum. This pretty much aligned with what he expected. Next, he switched to soul vision. He should have probably seen this coming too. But the clone didn't have a normal soul either. There was only a small silvery wisp burning in its chest. It looked like a gentle breeze could blow it out at any moment. Percy had a lot of questions now. Are they even useful? If it couldn't use magic, why invest so much time and mana to make one? Archibald smiled. The clone walked to the oak tree by the center of the garden and threw out a punch. Boom! Percy's ears buzzed as he stared at the devastation in shock. A large circular hole now pierced through the trunk, its diameter about half the width of the tree. The clone pointed its fist towards Percy, showing him that there wasn't even a scratch on it. As you can see, the clones inherit the physical capabilities of their creator. At Violet, each of my clones has over 240 times the speed, strength, and durability of somebody at Red. Archibald explained. Not just that, but the number of clones one can have also scales similarly. I can have 243 of them active at the same time, although they drain my mana constantly to exist. Normally, I only keep about 60 of them, so that I still have enough for other things. Percy swallowed hard. 243 monsters like that, that's a freaking army. His grandpa was even scarier than he realized. But we aren't here for me to brag. What we want is for you to watch me make one. Then Archibald stretched his palm towards the clone, visibly draining his mana back. As the green ribbons flowed out of its orifices, its visage shriveled like a mummy. Soon, it collapsed on the ground, its flesh desiccating at an alarming rate. It wasn't long before it was nothing but a sack of skin and bones. And moments later, even that collapsed into a pile of fine dust. Geez, thank Phoebe I haven't eaten anything. Percy wasn't generally squeamish, but watching what looked like his grandpa wither into nothingness like that was more than a little disturbing. Archibald chuckled. Why are you looking at me like that? Do you think your version is going to end up much prettier? Right? Percy had to figure out how to keep the worst of that from happening to his soul. Before we begin, do you have any other questions? Baldy asked. The young man looked back to where the clone had stood just moments ago. Please tell me you're going to burn those robes. The two had returned to Archibald's office. Baldy would rather sit while doing this, and Percy wanted none of this taking place inside his room. Currently, the young man had mana sense active, carefully observing everything happening between his grandpa's hands. There, a green bubble was suspended, pulsing like a heart at regular intervals. A dark silhouette was faintly visible beneath its surface, its shape resembling that of a fetus. And it was growing fast, really fast. It had only been about 10 minutes since Baldy began his demonstration. At the start, the glowing sphere had only been about as large as a pea, but it had already reached the size of a tangerine. According to his grandpa, it would only take about an hour for it to grow to a baby, at which point the bubble wouldn't be necessary anymore. This was all bizarre. Percy had seen other clones in the past, but this was his first time watching the gestation process. As much as his cousins loved to parade them around, nobody had time to show him how they were made. A red core had to spend 9 months to grow a clone, not unlike a normal pregnancy. From there, each grade cut that time to about a third. This meant most of his relatives needed anywhere between a little over a week to a full month to do this. Luckily, his grandpa would be done by tomorrow, so he could resume the arduous task of filling his second core up. Percy, I suggest you focus on what I'm doing, as I'm not repeating this for you. Baldy snapped. Right? The young man agreed, tapping into his mana sense again. This time, he didn't look at the bubble but focused on his grandpa's body instead. That's where all the interesting things were happening. Baldy's core thrummed, sending waves of mana rippling through every muscle, every bone, every vein. Once they reached the man's skin, they bounced back, but they did so at an angle. This seemed to create another stream of waves of a different shape, which flowed towards his hands. Yeah, okay. I still don't know how exactly I did what I did 2 months ago, but it wasn't nearly as organized as this. Percy spent a couple more hours carefully observing his grandpa's handiwork, marveling at the sheer elegance and refinement of the technique. Only after the clone had already reached the size of a toddler did he deactivate his mana sense. Not that he was bored. Far from it. He could have kept watching this for ages. Plus, he didn't want to waste his grandpa's efforts. The reason he had stopped was because at some point an idea took root in his head. Gathering the mana in his eyes, Percy activated soul vision. He watched the clone carefully, searching for something specific. Even though the clone lacked a complete soul, he remembered spotting a faint wisp in the one earlier. The young man knew life users didn't create them intentionally. After all, not even his grandpa had any way of manipulating soul mana. No. It's likely just a side effect. Watching the flow of life mana had certainly been informative, but if he could also observe how that silvery wisp came into being, it could give him some more insight into his own version. Percy was back in his room, resting on his bed. The sun was still out, as the duo had stayed up all night, his grandpa not finishing the demonstration until late in the following morning. Apparently, it was possible to pause the process and resume later, which other people had to do, as they couldn't keep it up for several months at a time. Archibald, on the other hand, preferred to make each clone in a single session. He said it helped minimize the mana losses. Either way, his grandpa's habits weren't what was going through the young man's head right now. How does that even make sense? Percy had devoted the last 15 or so hours of the demonstration trying to figure out how that tiny soul wisp had formed. And he did have an answer. He just struggled accepting it. The formation of the clone's body had been straightforward. The life mana had first traveled through Baldy, embedding all the necessary information before being passed to the clone. Once there, it had turned into the building blocks making up its flesh, guided by the accompanying information. There was a clear link between Archibald and the clone's bodies. But that wasn't the case when it came to their souls. At no point had Percy seen any soul mana leaving his grandpa. Yet, the clone's tiny soul had kept growing regardless. It was as if the two were entirely independent entities. As if the clone had developed its own soul as a natural consequence of being alive. This isn't what I want to be doing. Percy didn't want his own clones to be dumb as bricks. His affinity clearly didn't want that either, which was why his version of the ability involved splitting up his own soul. I suppose I'm gonna have to perform a lot of tests. But that was tomorrow's problem. For now, what he needed was some sleep. Chapter 13, Cousins. Percy marveled at the intricate vial pinched between his thumb and index finger. For something so valuable, it wasn't that large, its height and thickness not exceeding that of his pinky. At least, he didn't have to worry about breaking it if he dropped it by accident. This hardness wasn't a joke. It was made of a hollowed-out sapphire shard. A bit overkill in his opinion, using such a precious material for a simple container, but at the end of the day it didn't really matter. After all, the vial's contents were easily 50 times more expensive than the gemstone. Probably more. Plus, it can be reused. He shrugged, downing the elixir. The liquid was cool and soft as it trickled over his tongue and through his throat, giving him a refreshing feeling. It was bitter, though a hint of apple had clearly been added, to make it easier to swallow for the stereotypical noble able to afford it. Percy chuckled. I'd drink this even if it tasted like shit. Next, he pulled some mana from his sternum, gathering it in his stomach. Only after allowing it to simmer there for a few minutes did he move it back to his core. It stung every time he reabsorbed it, but he gritted his teeth and kept going, repeating the process over a dozen times before stopping. The whole cleansing took about half an hour, and his core burned when he was done, as if he had dipped it into a vat of acid. It's worth it. Percy was still getting used to the new elixirs, despite having used them for the past month. They hurt more than the heavily diluted version he'd drunk growing up, but they were more potent too. The good news was, they couldn't be used more than once a day, to avoid injuring oneself, which was great for his sanity. And his pocket. Supposedly, it was possible to advance one's grade via other means, but nobody did that, as it took way too long for it to be worth it. Plus, the cheap elixirs were essentially the same substance as the expensive ones but mixed with water in a ratio of 1 to 100, which just about made them affordable even for commoners. Well, assuming they didn't horribly mismanage their finances. Either way, thanks to his grandpa's generosity, Percy could now hopefully cut down the time needed before his next advancement in half, although 50 years were still nothing to scoff at. Perhaps, his second core would benefit from this treatment sooner. If it ever forms. The young man stood up, stretching his limbs. Baldy wasn't going to visit him today. Even though the plan had been to resume their sessions after the demonstration, it turned out he had shirked his responsibilities for a bit too long. Thus, he had told Percy he'd be extending their break by another day or two, to get everything back in order. If this was a month ago, he might have thought his grandpa was only making excuses to bail on him, but right now he wasn't concerned about that, seeing Archibald in a new light. Let's just enjoy the day off. Walking out of his room, he headed towards the main hall. That was where his family members picked and turned in missions. The same was true for Red Cores, although they could only select low-level missions that involved cleaning or doing other chores inside the house, as they weren't strong enough to survive outside. If it was up to Archibald, he wouldn't have let the Yellowborns out either, as they were too important to risk something happening to them. Still, he understood they wouldn't grow without adversity. In any case, Percy wasn't going there to pick a mission. He wouldn't have enough time to finish it before his training resumed anyway. No, the young man just wanted to meet people. Anybody would do. Not that he was particularly fond of his cousins, but after staring at Baldy for every waking moment over the past month, he itched to look at a different face. Preferably one with hair. Perhaps he should have been more careful of what he wished for, however. Soon after entering the hall, his attention was drawn to two loud voices joking and laughing by the counter. And he recognized them. Not them, of all people. Hector and Tristan were only a couple years older than him, but they were both Orangeborns, having advanced to Yellow a long time ago. At least he had slightly closed the gap, for now. But he didn't think that would stop them from giving him crap. Each of his cousins was accompanied by two identical copies of themselves, dressed in simpler, more practical clothes. Last time he'd seen them, they'd only had one. I guess even they have to put some effort in every now and then. Part of him wanted to bolt back to his room. Percy wasn't afraid of them, but he wasn't in the mood to deal with this right now. Still, it would look pathetic if he did that. Plus, he did want to get some fresh air for a change. In the end, he shrunk to a corner of the room, trying not to draw much attention. His cousins were chatting with their older sister, Laudin, who worked behind the counter. Percy didn't know if they were there to pick or turn in a mission, but they sure took their sweet time either way. There were others in the hall, but not too many. It was late in the morning, so the ones heading out had already left, while the ones coming back wouldn't be here until later. He was about to pick one of the least annoying relatives to approach, when his luck ran out. Well, well, if it isn't the little goblin, Hector said, keeping his voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard it. Percy rolled his eyes, pretending he didn't hear him. What? He's still alive. Tristan played along. I heard he passed out during his promotion. I haven't seen him for a couple of months, so I thought he died in his sleep. Turning to face them, Percy activated soul vision and imagined himself testing his new spell on his idiot cousins. Yellow or not, the buffoons wouldn't even see the knives coming before they pierced some nasty holes through their souls. Of course, he wasn't petty enough to torture somebody over some teasing. Not even them. Still, he wasn't above entertaining himself with the thought. Seriously, who even faints when advancing to orange? Hector emphasized his grade on purpose. Percy heard a few chuckles from the others in the room, but he didn't look. He wouldn't give them that. Morning assholes, he said as he approached the duo. I see you haven't been slacking off yourselves, he added, pointing at the clones with his chin. Of course, this is our family's prized bloodline after all. The pride of our house. Had this come from somebody else, Percy might have thought it was a joke. But seeing Tristan inflate like a pufferfish, he knew the guy meant his words. He shook his head, suppressing a chuckle. Passing by them, he walked to the board, wanting to browse through the missions, partly to extricate himself from the situation and partly out of genuine curiosity. But his cousins weren't done with him yet, it seemed. For silhouettes approached him from behind, nearing him uncomfortably. Turning to face them, he noted the clones' soulless gazes were even more creepy from up close. Percy, we have the perfect mission for you. One suitable for your talents. Hector sneered. Right? Help us test out our new clones in the garden. We tried to hunt some goblins in our last mission, but they were too weak. Maybe you can do slightly better. Tristan added. The corner of Percy's eye twitched. He'd been trying to not let them bother him too much, but they were starting to grate on his nerves. He wasn't going to seriously harm them over something this trivial, but perhaps they did deserve to be taught a lesson. The dysfunctional soul wisps burning in the clones' chests should be easy to snuff out, setting his cousins back by a couple of months. Maybe they would think twice before annoying him in the future. However, the soul mana had only begun to coalesce in his fists when he caught a bright flash of azure from the corner of his eyes. Chapter 14 Elaine. The four clones fell like marionettes with their strings cut, awkwardly hitting the floor. If these were normal people, they might have ended up with some nasty bruises, but their bodies were at yellow. Plus, healing them wasn't that hard. Why do you keep messing with others? Elaine yelled. She let the glowing whip fizzle out into a harmless spray of water, soon forming a faint puddle on the marble tiles. Then, she glared at her cousins, scoffing when they took a step back. The cowards only dared to bully those weaker than them. Turning to Percy, she dragged him out of the hall as he looked at her in amusement. He wasn't as defenseless as he used to be. She knew that. Still, seeing those morons treating him as their lesser irked her to no end. He deserved to be born at a higher grade than them. No, he deserved to be born at a higher grade than me. So absorbed was she in her thoughts that she was taken by surprise as Percy stopped abruptly. Where have you been over the last month? He asked, scanning her. She looked down at her body too. Her arms were covered in bandages, a few scrapes and bruises visible on her skin. I was out doing missions. For a whole month? He frowned. Then he winced. That's when Elaine remembered she was still holding him. Letting go, she quickly noticed the skin on his wrist was pink. Shit, I must have put more strength than I realized. I took a bunch of them at once to save time, she answered. He nodded. I see. Must be convenient, serving as target practice for archers right after trekking through a jungle. I'll try it sometime too. Why waste time healing in between? She chuckled. It wasn't that bad. Grandpa will fix me up in no time. Percy turned around, gesturing at her to follow. Only after they'd made a quick stop by Archibald's office to get her patched up did they head back towards the garden. Grandpa seemed really swamped today. Has anything happened while I was gone? She asked. I don't know. Maybe he needs to manage his time better. Percy scratched his head, looking at her rather awkwardly. Elaine narrowed her eyes but didn't say anything else. After exiting the mansion, they found a nice spot on the grass to sit. It was calming, listening to the crickets chirping, as faint shadows of clouds brushed over their heads. The garden was admittedly less exotic than the vibrant forests and swamps she'd recently traveled through, but she didn't have to worry about an ogre or a basilisk sneaking up on her here. Care to tell me what happened? He asked. What do you mean? I know testing my magic on that goblin wasn't the prettiest sight, but you could have talked to me instead of avoiding me. She frowned. Is that what he thought? I'm not avoiding you, she muttered weakly. Really? He raised an eyebrow. Because you barely said anything on the way back. Then you vanished for a month, putting yourself through a mission gauntlet. She sighed. That wasn't it. Not at all. But she couldn't tell him. What was she supposed to say? That she felt guilty watching him struggle? Did that even make sense? Back when she found him on the floor, she took care of him for a week. She'd known he'd done something dangerous with his ability, but she didn't realize just how dangerous until the test. A soul clone. Percy had ripped his very soul apart. The mere thought made her skin crawl. Still, it wasn't until she heard the goblin's shriek that she truly came to terms with the severity of the situation. Watching the creature squirm over the tiniest scratch, she couldn't fathom what Percy had experienced after tearing the whole thing up. Yet, after waking up, he spent the next few days training. Even while traveling, he kept practicing on horseback. Even after his injuries. The ones he got because I couldn't stay awake half an hour longer. Despite all the odds stacked against him, he never stopped pushing forward, doing everything he could to get stronger. Meanwhile, here she was, with her green core, everything handed to her on a silver platter, getting treated like royalty by her whole family just because she'd been born lucky. The irony made her sick to her stomach. Elaine. Percy looked at her with concern. She might have stayed silent for too long. It's nothing. I just figured I should train a bit harder, to live up to Grandpa's expectations. He nodded. You were right, you know, Percy said. She tilted her head. About Baldy. He's not that bad once you get to know him. You've been spending time together. She raised an eyebrow. Some, he grinned. That's great. What do you talk about? He fell back, resting his head on the grass before replying. All sorts of things really, like how many times he caught Uncle Gareth skipping on his shift. Or more recently, he's helping me figure out how to use my bloodline. Elaine felt her jaw tighten upon hearing that, clenching some dirt in her hand. Don't, she muttered. Please, don't use your ability again. She struggled to get the words out, her voice cracking. Percy gave her an odd look. Elaine, my ability is all I have. I can't give it up. What's even the point? She snapped. I don't want to sound harsh. I really don't. I don't want to sound like them. She felt hot streams trickle down her cheeks. But why do all this to yourself? Even if you become the strongest yellow core on Remier, it won't mean a damn thing. The moment the last word left her mouth, she felt her gut churn. She'd always hated herself just for thinking those things. And now I told him to his face. Elaine kept her gaze fixed on the ground, absent-mindedly tracking a ladybug as it walked up a blade of grass. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She knew what she just said was plain cruel. Maybe Percy would never speak to her again. The thought hurt, but it was okay. As long as he listens. The silence stretched on for a couple of minutes, even the crickets' chirps now sounding muted, as if they understood they should pipe down a notch. If that's all I ever amount to be, then so be it, Percy said, his voice calm. Elaine lifted her eyes. He was looking up at the sky. No, his gaze seemed to pierce through it, searching for something beyond. He wasn't upset or angry. Then his eyes met hers. He smiled. Either way, I won't be satisfied until I've done everything I can. Elaine was in her room, her eyes closed. Resting on a proper bed after a month in the wilderness was nice, but her thoughts were locked in her earlier conversation with Percy. By now she'd be a fool to believe she stood a chance of changing his mind. Still, it was comforting to know their relationship hadn't soured. In any case, there wasn't much point in ruminating over things she couldn't change. Instead, she should focus on those she could. Then, I won't be satisfied either. She opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling with resolve. Elaine was a yellow-born. She would reach Violet, no matter the cost, to support her grandpa and her family. But she shook her head. No. Not nearly good enough. If it was Percy in her shoes, he wouldn't be satisfied with that little. I won't stop until White, elevating the Avalon house to one of the great houses. Percy wouldn't live long enough to see her reach Violet, let alone White. The thought made a lump form in her throat, but it was okay. She could at least take care of others like him. Having made up her mind, she closed her eyes again. She would give herself this one night's sleep. She also had to restock her supply of elixirs before heading out. Training and missions couldn't speed up her advancement, but she could still hone her spells. It had been a long time since her status registered her crude magic. It's about time I take the next step. Chapter 15 Soul Clone. What's gotten into her? Percy had no idea what had brought on that outburst from Elaine yesterday. At least she'd seemed more concerned than hostile, which was good news. Unfortunately, he couldn't heed her plea to stop using his bloodline, especially now that he'd finished mending the cracks and could finally begin cultivating his first proper clone in earnest. Using soul vision, he scanned his soul carefully, willing his ability to activate. Unlike the previous time, he held back significantly, only allowing the tiniest strand of mana to seep out of his core. Careful, said Baldy, sitting next to him. Starting today, the two had resumed their training sessions, though his grandpa was currently focused on Percy's experiment, ready to intervene if necessary. Under the influence of his bloodline, the mana leapt out of his core more violently than usual, like a claw grasping everything in its path, pushing itself out of Percy's chest. The sudden pain made him wince, causing him to grab the mattress tightly, nearly ripping a hole in his bedsheets. Despite his preparations, he wasn't quite ready for this. He hurriedly deactivated his ability before it did any further damage. Are you okay? Baldy asked. It was only a few minutes later that the young man steadied his breath, calming down enough to answer. No wonder I passed out last time. Back then, I pushed all my mana into it like an idiot. He shook his head, reactivating soul vision to assess the situation. His soul was in much better shape than his previous attempt, but it hadn't exactly made it out scot-free either. A few new cracks had appeared near his chest, where the ghostly claw had tried piercing out of his body. They would only take a couple more days to heal, but it meant he had to slow things down again. At least, that gave him the chance to come up with a better plan. 3 days later, Percy pushed mana out of his core, letting it ripple through his soul. He'd already mended the new batch of cracks, but he wasn't ready to tap into his ability just yet. Instead, he was trying to replicate his family's technique to see what effect it might have in his case. His grandpa had made it look easy during his demonstration, but Percy quickly discovered that getting the waves of mana to flow properly was rather tricky. Where almost all of Baldy's mana had reflected uniformly off his skin and towards his hands, Percy's instead bounced randomly from one corner of his soul to the other. He struggled to get even a tenth of it to head in the correct direction. Whenever he adjusted the intensity or the angle of the flow to make one side of his soul work, the rest fell out of phase. Though Percy wasn't deterred, knowing a lot of it came down to practice. After all, Archibald had been using this technique for centuries. Still, there was another issue. Life mana was meant to flow through one's physical body, which was relatively rigid. This wasn't the case for Percy, who was channeling it through his soul, flickering around like an amorphous flame. That said, it wasn't all gloom and doom. Let's hope this works better. He and Archibald had modified the technique slightly, hoping to make it more suitable for him. Rather than gathering the mana in his hands, forming the clone between his palms, they figured it would be easier to concentrate it near his chest, just an inch from his sternum. After all, that was clearly where his ability wanted it to go. Percy pulled mana from his core, sending it randomly in all directions. Some was reflected towards his sternum right away, while the rest bounced around a few times. Overall, about a quarter eventually made it to his chest where he wanted it, albeit at different intervals. Most of it, however, either leaked from his pores or got reabsorbed into his core. We might be on to something. Try playing with the timing until the waves converge. His grandpa advised after being brought up to speed. Percy nodded. The young man stared intently at the small silvery bump right in front of his core. He'd spent a long time observing how the mana got reflected, playing with it as he fired it in various directions, eventually managing to gather about 40% of it at once. It had taken him another week to get here, and he didn't think he'd be able to improve much more in the short term. Thus, he and Archibald had agreed to try and make do with this current version of the technique. Percy repeated his actions, observing the changes. As soon as the waves gathered, they caused his soul to swell in that spot for an instant. I almost looked like a pregnant lady, except he wasn't a lady. Plus, the bump was in his chest, not his belly, and in his soul, not his flesh. It also didn't last long before deflating. And he wasn't trying to carry a baby, but a ghostly clone he could send out to uncover the secrets of the universe. Still close enough. The biggest problem is that it reverts right away, so I don't have enough time to make progress. If only I could hold it there for a moment. Baldy scratched his chin. Well, why can't you? The young man pondered over his grandpa's question. It wasn't like he hadn't considered it, but there were a few issues with that. The first was that his soul flowed about an inch under his skin, so it was harder to grab a hold of. I suppose if I time it right, I can catch it when it bumps. The other problem wasn't as easy to solve, however. He'd need to use his mana to interact with his soul, which was dangerous. If he wasn't careful, he might injure himself. He sighed. No pain, no gain. Once more, Percy fired the mana from his core, letting it bounce all over. At the same time, his eyes remained glued to the area right in front of his sternum. The moment his soul bulged, he closed his fingers around it, grabbing the protrusion as softly as he could. Over the past 5 days, the young man had learned to coat his hand in a layer of soul mana. At first, it had looked like a glove, though it hadn't taken him long to realize he didn't need to cover his whole palm. Only his fingertips ever came in contact with his soul. Right now, his right hand looked like he had stabbed 5 silver cherries with his fingers. It was a bit silly, but he didn't care about optics. Just a little more. Percy pulled his soul gently, letting it stretch like an elastic fabric. Everything was going well, at least while the silver flame remained within the confines of his flesh. The moment part of it exited his skin, however, all hell broke loose. Garg. His soul squirmed, frantically struggling to return inside his body where it belonged, plunging Percy into a world of agony in the process. Soldiering through it, he held on to the bump, as tears formed not only where he touched it, but in other parts of his soul. At least it wasn't his first time going through something like this. Though souls were surprisingly resistant to blunt damage, that only seemed to be the case while they remained within the safety of their body. Once removed, they apparently turned a lot more fragile. Still, Percy had never expected to use his bloodline painlessly. His only goal had been to optimize the process as much as possible, to minimize the risks involved. Can't make a soul clone without a few cracks. A few seconds later, the young man's lips curled up as the situation stabilized somewhat, the pain becoming more bearable. A few tears continued to form, but not as quickly as before. Next, he used his family's technique again, sending more waves of mana around his soul. This time, he allowed the new cracks to absorb whatever mana they could, to offset some of the damage. Percy remained in that position for several hours, slowly feeding the nascent clone while struggling to keep his soul from falling apart. The trickiest part was that he ran out of mana every so often, forcing him to hold everything still until he recovered enough to continue. It's going well, all things considered. The bump in his hand had already quadrupled in size, though he wasn't sure how much he needed for a functioning clone. Shrugging, he let go of his soul, watching it snap back into his body. It sucked to give up on the last 5 hours of work, but he wouldn't be able to complete his clone during this session. Sadly, he couldn't pause and resume his progress like the others, which meant he'd have to do the whole thing in one go. I seem to be on the right track. I'll go for it after a good night's sleep. Next, he wiped the sweat off his brow before turning to Baldy. He was about to explain his thought process, when he found his grandpa staring at him with a shit-eating grin plastered all over his face. What's up with the creepy look? Percy, I didn't want to interrupt you earlier, but your second core stopped accepting mana 2 hours ago. Chapter 16 Second Core. It took him a few moments to truly register Baldy's words. Then, it was as if the floodgates opened, a wave of vigor washing away his fatigue. His heartbeat sped up, as he willed his status to appear. Percival Avalon. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Orange. Soul. Mana core 2. Red.
Ew.
Bloodline. Clone. Create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity.
Ew. Hey.
Grants access to your status.
Hey.
Grants a bloodline.
Hey.
Grants a second mana core. Finally! It had taken months, although they'd felt closer to centuries. But it was finally over. Of course, Percy would be lying if he said he wasn't slightly disappointed. He had secretly harbored hope of the new core awakening at a higher grade. If only it could have started off at yellow, it would have changed everything. But alas, there was no point letting his greed spoil an otherwise good thing. Well? Baldy asked. Percy looked at his grandpa. His expression was also bright, painted with curiosity and excitement. This is all because of him. He wouldn't forget the countless hours Archibald had spent filling his core up, one drop at a time. How could he? The man had competed with a Titanus, and won. Well, okay. It was more of a tie, and he cheated. Still, few could boast of the same. Thanks, Percy said. For everything. Some moisture gathered in the corner of his grandpa's eyes. But then he blinked, and it was gone. Next, he raised his hand towards Percy's forehead and flicked him. Ouch, the young man exclaimed. What was that for? If you want to thank me, stop torturing me and tell me what your status says. Still a prick though. Percy rolled his eyes. What is there to say? Is it red which sucks? The affinity has question marks. Baldy nodded. Then, he took something out of his robe. It was a long bandage, covered in all sorts of strange glyphs. What's this? Percy frowned. It's warded to conceal mana. From now on, make sure to always have it around your waist. It will hide your second core from mana sense, although only while it's idle. Don't use it in front of others. Percy accepted it, before wrapping it as per his grandpa's instructions. Well then, can you feel it inside your body? Baldy asked. Try using it. The young man didn't need to be told twice, also eager to put his new toy in action. Closing his eyes, he recalled his experience sensing his original core for the first time, right after his awakening. Turning his senses inward, he scanned the area around his abdomen, searching for the new organ. Perhaps he could have used mana sense to speed up the process, but he didn't mind taking a bit longer. Frankly, this all felt nostalgic, and he wanted to savor it. Pinpointing the core's location with any certainty took a few minutes. The new vessel was empty, without a hint of mana flowing in or out, making it hard to spot. I guess that makes sense. Percy's first course of action would be to fill it. With some mental prodding, he managed to stir it up. Repeating the exercises he had been taught as a child, he tried to pull the first strand of ambient mana into it. It was difficult, like pushing honey through a blocked pipe. Of course, the young man wasn't a novice in mana manipulation, having done this daily for the last decade. Still, he normally used the core in his sternum for that, and an entirely different set of mana channels. Learning everything again would take some time. I'll need a couple of days to get it to a usable state. A week passed, which was a bit longer than his estimates. Having gone through all of this before certainly helped, but it wasn't exactly smooth sailing either. It was like learning to write with his left hand. Well, if I only found out I even had a left hand 5 minutes ago. That said, he eventually got there. He could now reliably draw mana into his new core, albeit clumsily. Catching up to the other one would take longer though. In any case, he had finally filled it up. His capacity was a bit lacking due to its grade, but that didn't mean he was without gains. As soon as Percy drew the first sliver of mana, he noticed an immediate change in his body. His muscles surged with strength, his senses sharpening as he felt more alive. He'd expected this, having experienced something similar during his recent promotion. The changes were more subtle this time around, but it did confirm his second core would also influence his body and, with some luck, his lifespan. While he didn't know how it would all scale, He guessed raising both to yellow might even let him live long enough to reach green. That's in the distant future though. For now, let's see what I can do with it. During the past week, Percy hadn't pulled any mana out of his second core. He had only focused on clearing the first few channels and filling it up. It was finally time for the main event. Hopefully we can figure out its type without another assessment, Baldy said. Hearing his grandpa, Percy's feelings on the topic were complicated. Having another rare affinity would be amazing, but it would indeed raise some complications. He couldn't exactly go back to the temple, could he? How would he explain it? Fingers crossed for a life affinity. It was one of the few rare affinities they wouldn't have trouble identifying on their own. Also, it would let him use the regular form of his bloodline too. The duo activated Mana Sense. As Percy pulled some mana towards his hand, the flow was partially obstructed, another channel he would have to clear later, but not right now. A blob of psi and soon coalesced inside his palm. Felt nothing like soul mana. First, it was visible to the naked eye, its color close to Elaine's. But it wasn't a water affinity, this was a couple shades paler. Another difference was that it had substance. Unlike the ethereal wisps of soul mana which he now knew he could only hold with his soul, he could feel this new energy pressing against his skin as he squished it in his fist. His expression stiffened, a bad premonition bubbling up. He turned to Baldy, only to see his smile had also soured.
I'm sorry, Percy.
The young man's heart sank as he opened his status once more, reading the new word that had appeared next to his second core's grade. Mana Core 2, Red, Pure. The status was a strange thing. While the affinity tests were a guaranteed way to fill in many of the blanks, a lot of the information could also be revealed based on one's comprehension. It was why common affinities were so easy to identify, as everyone was familiar with them. Had Percy known more about soul mana, he could have even recognized it on his own, saving him the trip. For the same reason, it wasn't very difficult to identify his newest mana type. Not that he was particularly happy about that. What sort of bullshit is this? Somehow, his second core had ended up at an even lower starting point than his first. Not only at red, but also lacking an affinity. Percy doubted he'd get much use out of it. Even when he raised it to orange, 5 years from now, it would at most let him produce some weak attacks at the level of a red core. Baldy placed his hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. Don't let this get to you. It's still a good thing. The young man remained silent for a minute. Grandpa, have you ever heard of a way to change one's affinity? Or to raise one's grade faster? Archibald sighed. Neither of those things exist on Remier, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do on some distant world. The universe is vast. Percy's eyes regained some luster, though Baldy's subsequent words quashed the rising hope. You shouldn't count on that. Archibald shook his head. Even bringing back a second core from the Morai was an exceptional stroke of luck. You may never stumble on another treasure on that level. The young man clenched his fists as he read his status once more. At least the physical enhancements from his second core would help. Also, his soul projectiles should be close to registering as a proper crude spell. But he was still a long way from bridging the gap with his peers. There was only one way forward, albeit riddled with uncertainties. I'll send out my next clone tomorrow. I'll comb the ends of the universe if I have to, until I find another way to get stronger. Chapter 17, A Painful Endeavor. Today was the day. Percy had finished mending the new cracks, restoring his soul to a pristine condition. He'd also refilled both cores and got a good night's sleep. Adding to that, Baldy had arranged for his children to manage the family, freeing himself to oversee his grandson's venture. Admittedly, Percy felt a little guilty over it. Somehow, their strained relationship had evolved to the point of him monopolizing his grandpa's time, which he knew was precious. The man was a violet with an entire house to run and hundreds of people to look after, yet here he was, focusing his efforts on a red-born teenager. I'll make it up to him. Even if he couldn't find a way to get stronger, he had to bring something back for his family. Going over all the steps in his mind once more, Percy cleared his thoughts, beginning the process. First, he activated Soul Vision, tuning it to look at his own soul. Gathering mana on his fingertips, he placed his hand right in front of his sternum. Next, he sent a pulse of mana through his soul, letting it reflect off its edges. The moment it all returned to his chest, he seized the opportunity to grab the newly formed bump. He slowly pulled it outwards, ignoring the painful tears that started to form as the silver flame left the boundary of his flesh. Only after it stabilized did he send another pulse of mana from his core, trying to reinforce the damaged regions as he forced the protrusion to enlarge. So far, so good. Wave after wave, refill after refill, hour after hour, Percy continued to cultivate the ethereal substance in his hand. It was the very fabric he would craft his clone from. Soon after starting, he'd been elated to discover his soul was more durable than last time. He guessed the awakening of his second core had influenced it. Neither Percy nor Archibald had ever heard that one's grade affected their soul, but then again, they hardly knew much about soul affinities to begin with. In hindsight, it wasn't that odd either. The fact that promotions strengthened one's body was common knowledge. It would be stranger if they didn't have a similar impact on other aspects of one's existence. If this hadn't been the case, A red core with a soul affinity would be able to kill a white with a sneaky spell, which was absurd to imagine. Either way, the young man gladly welcomed all the help he could get. And it did help, as his soul was noticeably more resilient, the tears forming just a touch more slowly. Waiting for his core to refill for the umpteenth time, he tossed a quick glance out the window. The sun is about to set. Apparently, he'd been at it for over 12 hours. The orb in his hand was already larger than an apple. He was getting tired too, the concentration and pain taking a toll on his mind. His original plan had been to pull an all-nighter, gathering as much of his soul as possible before cutting out the clone. But that didn't seem very realistic now. While he could push himself to go on, it appeared there was a limit to how much of his soul he could pull out at once. The more he accumulated, the greater the pressure was, causing the cracks to appear faster. Right now, the damage was piling up more quickly than his newly strengthened soul and his manual reinforcement could handle. Okay then, let's move to the next phase ahead of time. As soon as his core was refilled, he pulled the soul mana again. Unlike before, he didn't send another pulse, instead gathering it manually inside the blob. For the next 2 hours, Percy filled the orb with as much mana as he could manage, causing it to glow more brightly, until even Baldy could faintly see it. Moving the mana directly into it resulted in fewer losses, but the bump didn't grow in size. Unless the mana traveled through his soul first, it didn't have that effect. That was clearly an aspect of his bloodline he'd inherited from his family. The reason he was adding more mana to the orb was to give his clone some means of protecting himself later. He didn't know what circumstances he'd find himself in, but he figured having a stockpile of mana to fall back to might be handy. Or maybe not. He shrugged. But it's worth a shot. Finally, he refilled his core one last time and, after giving his grandpa a resolute look, he fully activated his ability. The ghostly claw violently bolted out of his sternum, heading straight towards the thrumming blob. Wherever it passed, it carved nasty gouges in the silver flame, causing Percy to experience a world of agony. Not just that, but the tears that already existed widened, making the situation worse. Only after the claw entered the blob did something change. As it began to sizzle, the orb swelling and contracting around it a couple of times. Then, snap, a loud shockwave rippled through Percy. The last thing he saw before his eyelids fell shut was a silver comet blasting out of his bedroom's wall. Go! Soar through the cosmos, little me. Damn! Was the first word that came out of his mouth. The original Percy's that was not the clone's. His head ached as if it had been split in half. And if not, perhaps he should consider it. It might be an improvement. He was lying on his bed, in a pool of sweat, the sheets sticking to his back. How are you feeling? Baldy asked, sitting on a chair next to him. The man's hand was raised, a gentle green glow radiating from it. Not that it did much, as the source of Percy's pain wasn't something life mana could help with. Still, he did appreciate the gesture. Like I've torn out a part of my soul. The young man grinned. How long was I out this time? Just the night. Percy exhaled in relief. This was good. Not only had he recovered much sooner, but he'd done so before his clone returned, which was progress. Evidently, his efforts over the past few weeks hadn't been for naught. But thinking of a possibility, he paled. Unless the clone crumbled earlier than the last one? Panicking, he tried pulling some mana to his eyes, to check his soul's condition. He frowned. His core was surprisingly empty. It should have recovered on its own by now, since he'd slept for a long time. Over the next few minutes, he meditated to speed up his regeneration, managing to manually gather some mana, eventually. Turning soul vision on, he examined himself, his features soon twisting at the sight. His soul was in even worse shape than the first time he'd ever laid eyes on it. Technically, it wasn't too surprising. Back then, it had already had weeks to heal on its own before he learned about his affinity. Still, the sight was unsettling to behold. The tears were too wide and too deep to be described as cracks anymore. Some regions looked like they were held together by a few scant strands, about to break off any moment now. But the worst part was the hole in his chest. It was as if a giant had scooped out a huge chunk of his soul with an oversized spoon, as the edges in the crater squirmed, leaking mana. That explains why my core is empty. Apparently, his soul was frantically sucking the mana out of his sternum, trying to hold itself together. Yet it wasn't all bad news. Stretching out of the hole in his chest, Percy felt something extending into the distance. It was invisible even to soul vision, somehow even less corporeal than soul mana. If he had to describe it, it was as if somebody had grabbed an idea and rolled it up into a rope, like an umbilical cord, letting him sense that his soul clone was still out there somewhere. Only then did he let out the turbid breath he'd been holding. At least, it wasn't all for nothing. He sure hoped his clone would survive longer than the other one, and if he was lucky, even bring back something useful when it was done. For now, he could find comfort in the fact he was awake and could do other things while waiting. It didn't seem he could practice his soul magic, as his mana was still busy trying to keep his soul together. But perhaps he could feed his second core elixirs and get a bit more used to it over the next few days. Back to the grind, I suppose. Chapter 18, Wanderer. His thoughts were groggy, taking ages to form. Or maybe seconds. He couldn't tell. Actually, Percy couldn't tell much of anything at the moment. He was blind and deaf. His sense of touch was gone too. The last thing he remembered was activating his bloodline, watching it tear his soul up. Either I botched it and killed myself or I'm the clone. Both conclusions sounded possible, though he felt it was more productive to assume the latter. At least it was good he retained some sense of self this time. On his previous attempt, this had only happened on the way back. It was certainly nice to have some control over the process. Well, assuming he could figure out what was going on, let's focus on what I can tell. The most prominent feeling was something attached to him, pulling him towards a certain direction. The force it exerted was currently weak, but it was strengthening very, very slowly. For now, it didn't affect him much, but he knew it would become irresistible eventually. Perhaps it had to do with how much strength the clone him had left. Or maybe with how badly his main body wanted him back. Or something else entirely. Either way, he should try finding a vessel before that happened. If only I could see. His normal senses didn't work, but there had to be something he could do. Concentrating outwards, he filtered out the attraction of his body, trying to grasp at anything else. For a long time there was nothing. Then, something appeared at the edge of his consciousness. Curious, he focused on it, causing it to expand and expand until, bump, Percy felt an impact, shaking his very existence. What the hell? Whatever it was now getting more distant. Making a mental note to approach things more slowly in the future, he wondered why he'd been rejected. Was there a reason he couldn't possess that person? Actually, was that even a person? Unable to tell, he resumed the experimentation. He repeated the same steps for some time until another object appeared. Proceeding with more caution, he limited himself to fleeting glimpses. Each time he looked, it grew larger. Stopping when he was close enough, he went over what he understood about it, making sure not to focus too hard, to avoid crashing into it again. It felt like a soul, although it was his first time encountering one in his present state. He'd seen plenty of them before via soul vision, but that was nothing like his current perspective. That said, this object gave him a conflicting mix of familiarity and strangeness. On one hand, it resembled his original self, still tugging at him through the connection. On the other, this was clearly somebody else. Also, there was a sense of rejection. Whenever he stopped looking, he felt himself drift further and further. I suppose I wouldn't want to be possessed either. Nor did he want to do that to somebody else, actually. He still felt guilty over possessing that baby. He'd rather approach things differently this time if he could help it. Once more, he scanned his surroundings, struggling a little as the soul obstructed his senses. Instinctively, he wished to move away from it, which seemed to work, the object shrinking in his vision. Percy continued until he was satisfied with the distance. It only took a second. Or did it? Come to think of it, he hadn't a clue how long it had been, nor how far he'd traveled. But he guessed it should be measured at a cosmic scale. After all, he'd essentially sleepwalked out of Remir last time. Focus, Percy. The young man, or perhaps the even younger soul fragment, felt the pull of his main body growing stronger. He still had time, relatively speaking, but he needed to make some progress. He reached outwards once more. A third soul appeared, but he didn't approach it just yet. He kept concentrating until a fourth and a fifth joined it. Before long, or maybe after long, a sea of souls surrounded him from every direction. It was nice to have some choice, assuming he could pick from those, of course. Still, it was annoying he couldn't examine them too closely, lest he approached one by accident. Instead, he had to tiptoe around the swarm, trying to learn about them without looking directly. As he allowed his senses to softly brush over the myriad lights, a strange thought crossed his mind. This is beautiful. He didn't fully understand what laid in front of him, but he suddenly realized he didn't want to rush things. Perhaps no human had ever experienced anything like this. Percy felt a bubbling urge to take his time, appreciating the exotic scenery, to truly understand it. Even if he failed to find a body today, he would learn a lot for his next attempt. Thus, he relaxed, letting go of his previous urgency. The lights came in all shapes and sizes. Lacking anything to measure them with, he could only compare them to one another. Some were tiny. There were countless of them clustered together, and he felt they were so weak he could snuff them out even in his current state. Bugs, maybe. The brightest of them outshone the sun. The mere thought of approaching sending a wave of terror through his splintered consciousness. Those must be gods. Still numerous, given the scale of the universe, but far scarcer than the other types. Percy had never seen a god in person, not even back on Remir, though he'd seen plenty of statues and illustrations, and stolen a titanous mana. That said, he didn't want anything to do with these alien deities. Most of them were probably hostile to his species. Instinctively, he wished to move away, but he didn't know which way to go. There was one no matter where he looked. Calm down, Percy. They can't find you here. Pressing down his fear, he considered categorizing the souls using something other than their brightness. Once more, he scanned them, looking for a different way to tell them apart. That's when he sensed a rather peculiar soul. Curious, he approached. In terms of potency, it was far more powerful than the insects, and infinitely weaker than the gods. Well, duh. Sadly, that was about the extent of what he could discern. Beyond that, reds and whites didn't look too different. Hopefully that would change with more practice. In any case, this wasn't the aspect he was interested in. Unlike the others, the soul felt wrong somehow. It was fluttering erratically and dimming quickly. Then Percy made a mistake. In his attempt to learn more about it, he focused on it a little more than he'd meant to, causing him to approach it rapidly. Growing nearer, he averted his gaze, trying to stop. It was difficult. For some reason, this one wasn't rejecting him. It was pulling him in. Intensifying his efforts, Percy actively steered away, eventually managing to slow down. Just in time too, as he had come this close to getting sucked right in. A moment later, the light fizzled out of existence, disappearing forever. Wow, I think the poor guy just died. At least that solved the mystery of how to possess somebody. Evidently, only those on the verge of death seemed to lower their defenses, allowing others to approach. Perhaps it was some desperate, last-ditch effort to survive. It was a little morbid, but it was comforting to know he hadn't taken over and killed a healthy baby. The alien he'd possessed had probably been a stillborn or something. Suddenly, Percy was dragged out of his thoughts, as he found himself on the move again. Another soul was pulling him. However, this one wasn't some dying stranger. It was his main body. Apparently, his time here had ran out. The force wasn't very strong just yet. He could still resist if he wanted, but he knew that wouldn't be the case for long. Truth be told, he wasn't too bummed out. Even though his original mission had failed, he'd learned a lot about this place, which would greatly help him in his future ventures. Still, the main body will be so disappointed. The pull was somewhat distracting, but he eventually managed to peer into the sea of souls again. Having a clearer idea of what to look for, he scanned through them much faster than before. He ignored those too powerful or too weak, and he didn't spare the healthy ones a second glance either. Eventually, his attention landed on another dimming light. But he didn't approach it. It was dying even faster than the one before. Whatever had killed it had done a thorough job. It would suck to possess a body only to find out it had been beheaded. I need something a bit more on the fence so that I might survive. And I need to do it fast. The pull from the main body grew stronger, this time forcing him to actively exert effort to resist it. Percy found a few more damaged souls, but they didn't fit. One was too powerful, 3 were dying too quickly, 1 was too tiny. It didn't seem like it was meant to be, but it was okay. At least he'd tried. Percy was close to accepting his failure, when he suddenly spotted another dying light. It was a bit stronger than he would have liked. He didn't know if that would be a problem. Also, it was fading a touch too fast. Even if he possessed it, he'd probably die again soon. An unpleasant thing to experience for nothing. Still, he didn't have much to lose. Well, hopefully not. Okay, let's do it. Mobilizing every iota of his will, he resisted his body's pull for the briefest of instants, reaching for the dying light. The next moment, he felt it enlarge. Then he was gone. Chapter 19, Possessed. Percy found himself in an odd state. He was still unable to see or hear anything, but he had finally stopped moving. His body's pull was much fainter too. It was there, yet it couldn't pry him out of wherever he was. His attempt to possess the dying light had clearly done something, though he wasn't sure what. It's like my limbs are twisted and stuffed inside a messy crate. Well, assuming he even had limbs. Logically, this body should have something of the sort, but he couldn't move a muscle just yet. Percy tried shifting around. He appeared to still be in a soul form. His very existence slipped through the nooks and crannies of a cramped container. Suddenly, one of the objects he was in contact with gave way under the pressure, shattering into nothing. The other soul. It's not completely gone. Percy tried to untangle himself from his host spirit, feeling more pieces crumble. At the same time, the pull strengthened slightly. Apparently, he couldn't afford to damage it too much or there would be nothing left to anchor him to this place. Can you stop that? That wasn't his thought. The words echoing through his mind were foreign, spoken in some language he'd never heard of. Still, he could understand them, as they seemed to be conveyed alongside their underlying meaning. Percy would have frowned if he still had lips. Who are you? He asked. A wave of amusement intruded into his mind. Who do you think? Or did you walk into my body by accident? Okay, that was a dumb question. In Percy's defense, he hadn't expected he'd be sharing. Nothing of the sort had happened that one other time. Then again, the last body was an infant. You monster! You possessed a baby? The soul yelled in outrage. Percy found himself at a loss for words. He hadn't meant to share that. For what it's worth, it was an accident. Also, it was dying already, I think. Get out, you fiend! This time, the other soul was the one to shift around, trying to push him out. The only thing it managed, however, was to damage itself even more. A wave of pain assaulted Percy, but it wasn't his own. Cut it out. Are you trying to destroy yourself? Silence, demon! The soul yelled. I would rather die than let you defile my body. Percy was about to swear but paused. Perhaps this was the normal reaction to getting possessed. If there was even such a thing as normal in this situation. Still, it would be a waste to die within 3 minutes of getting here. Can we talk about this first? He asked. I promise I'll leave on my own if we can't come to an agreement. What is there to discuss? I've lived my whole life as a proud warrior of Huahue. I won't let my death change that. Percy focused on the most interesting piece of information his soulmate had shared. Hue? Is that the name of this world? This time, a wave of shock hit him, giving him a bad premonition. Somehow, he'd made the already precarious situation even worse. You don't even know that? Outsider? The soul doubled its efforts to evict him. At this rate, it would only be a few moments until it fell apart. Even the second-hand pain reaching Percy through the connection was difficult to endure. Whatever his host was going through must have been a dozen times worse. But it didn't seem to care. What do you have against outsiders? I didn't even know about this place before now, he said. Liar. It's people like you who ruined everything. I'd sooner let my body be possessed by a Kroka-Arosich than scum like you. Percy was about to give up. The pull was starting to pry him off the body, and it didn't seem like its owner could be reasoned with. Still, he tried one last time. Look, I have no clue who these outsiders you hate are, but why would they take over your body? Do you have anything they want? Against all odds, that did seem to slow the soul's efforts slightly, as it appeared to ponder over Percy's question, though it didn't drop its resistance entirely. Who knows? You people have already taken everything. Our world, our heritage, our freedom. Perhaps you decided it wasn't enough anymore, and you want our dignity too. The soul's words were scathing, but Percy felt something more than fury behind them, an indescribable sorrow. I'm sorry those things happened to you, he replied. I have no interest in possessing somebody by force. If you would like to live a little longer, I can try holding whatever's left of you together for a while. I won't do anything else without permission. This time, the spirit stopped fighting. However, many of the fragments had already shattered. Percy found it difficult to hold on, especially as he treaded a narrow line between anchoring himself and not squeezing the pieces too tightly. How do I know you're telling the truth? It asked after a while. Percy sent what he hoped would come across as a mental shrug. You can always kick me out later if I try anything funny. The soul remained silent for a while. He was about to remind it they were running out of time when it spoke. Can you even do as you claim? Beats me. Your earlier tantrum certainly made things harder. Still, unless you have a better idea, I can do my best. The spirit didn't say anything, which Percy assumed was a yes. Of course, what he had promised was easier said than done. His host had already been dying when he found it, suggesting its body and soul hadn't been in great shape to begin with. Now it was even worse, not to mention that he could hardly even touch the fragments without destroying them. Although, it's been a while since the last one shattered, he realized. Perhaps the fact his host had tentatively agreed to work with him had somehow raised their compatibility. In any case, he had to work fast. Shifting his own soul around, he wrapped the shards as gently as possible. Unlike before, each time he touched one, memories flashed through his mind. The darkness of a damp cell, the taste of rotten meat, the sting of nasty wounds, the thrill of victory, the bitterness of defeat, the pride of a broken people, the pain of betrayal. It was too much, but Percy pushed it all aside. He could ask questions later, if they survived. For now, he kept stretching all of himself, trying to use what he was, to fill in the gaps of what the spirit was missing. At some point, he'd shrouded many of the shards, hugging them gently but firmly. They anchored him here, and he hoped he'd act as a bridge between them. The result was a mixed bag. At least, the damage had stopped mounting, but his host wasn't exactly functional. Furthermore, Percy couldn't tap into the body's senses either. Why was it so much easier with the baby? Maybe it was because the latter had lacked a will, making it more malleable, easier to meld with. Out of options, the young man thought back to the bundle of soul mana his main body had generously bestowed him. He hadn't used it yet. Of course, he wasn't sure it would do anything, but it wasn't like he'd need it if he failed anyway. Allowing it to unravel, he felt the mana flow outwards. The substance eagerly rushed to the edges of his fragmented soul, beginning to do what it did best, repairing it. And as luck would have it, it ran into another soul in dire need of mending at those exact spots. Like glue, it lodged itself between the cracks, bringing the souls closer together as the spirit's memories flooded him with greater intensity. There was way too much to sift through, though Percy focused on one thing specifically as they reached equilibrium. His new pal's name. Mictlantecuhtli. Chapter 20 Mickey. I'm not calling you that. How about Mickey? Suit yourself. I doubt we'll survive in this state for very long anyway. Various senses assaulted Percy, from the external ones such as the thick odors of moss and excrement, to the internal ones like his chest heaving up and down, or the cold numbness of narrowly missed death crawling along his limbs. His body felt unfamiliar, plus he wasn't in control. He could try taking over, if he really wanted, but he'd promised not to. Besides, their soul wouldn't take another round of infighting. Mickey blinked as a drop landed in his eye. When he next opened it, Percy paid more attention to their surroundings. It was dark, the only source of light being the fluttering flame of a mounted torch somewhere in the distance. They were in a closed space that looked a bit like a cave, only one side covered in thick metallic bars. He recognized this place. It was the cell from Mickey's memories. Is this where you live? It is, for the latter half of my life at least, and the first part of my afterlife too, it seems. Percy felt a pang of amusement seep through their connection. Then his host stood up, the pain making both of them wince. That was when the young man remembered their body was a mess. Damn, dying isn't a joke. Tell me about it. Many places hurt, but none as much as a region right above their stomach. There appeared to be a gaping hole, perhaps the very wound that had claimed Mickey's life. Even the slightest shift rattled their innards, making Percy sick. It was lucky he wasn't in charge, or they might have thrown up by now. The most annoying part was that his host clearly didn't give a shit, stretching his legs as if everything was fine. Are you sure you should be moving around so much? I don't know if you've noticed, but you're not in the best shape. Mickey made a weird guttural sound that trailed off a bit like a cackle. I'm well aware of my injuries. I was there when they happened. Next, he flexed his arms, shocking Percy, who just now registered they had a couple too many. Must be convenient having 4 hands. Why? How many do you have? Just 2. You wouldn't be able to play the kicklet. The image of a long flute-like instrument with dozens of holes appeared in his mind. It was wide like a trumpet on one end, though 2 shafts lead to it. He still couldn't understand Mickey's language, but their link made communication convenient at least, if a bit intrusive. Now what? Percy asked. What do you mean? What do you mean? What do I mean? Isn't there anything you want to do with your extra time? Somebody you'd like to speak to? His host remained quiet for a couple moments before replying. You really don't know anything about Hue, do you? I'm sorry if you were expecting to be a passenger on some exotic vacation. The only thing your little stunt has bought us are a couple more fights before we die again. Fights? Mickey shook his head, a universal gesture it seemed. He didn't bother explaining. Returning to the spot where they'd woken up, he looked at a small puddle on the ground. The water dripping from the ceiling was mixed with blood, but Mickey wasn't deterred, scooping some with his lower left hand before bringing it to his face. Under other circumstances, Percy might have berated his host over his lack of hygiene. Right now, however, he was too busy gawking at the guy's reflection, faintly visible on the surface of the murky water. For the most part, he resembled a human, even his skin color not too dissimilar to his own, if a couple shades tanner. Though it was covered in all sorts of tribal tattoos, some depicting various celestial objects, while others showed Mickey's people in various poses. Is it some kind of traditional dance? Not all the symbols were easy to make out, partly due to the poor lighting, and partly due to the crisscrossing scars of all shapes and sizes marring Mickey's body. His build was bulky too, his muscles toned, but Percy chalked those up to the harsh life he'd clearly lived. There were other more glaring differences too, of course. Besides the obvious mismatch in the number of limbs, Mickey's nose and mouth were fused together into a long, pointy beak. While his eyes and scalp weren't very different to Percy's, his ebony hair looked a little odd, reminding the young man of the fluff he often saw in newborn birds. His host moved again, shaking Percy out of his thoughts, as he walked to a wall before plopping down, resting his back on the coarse stone. It was cold and hard, except for a spot that felt a little grimy. A patch of moss most likely. Not the coziest seat, though it still felt unbelievably sweet right now, considering how unpleasant standing had been. Equally unpleasant was the terrible stench that assaulted their nostrils, which only intensified as Mickey grabbed its source, bringing it to his mouth. Please, for the love of all that is holy, tell me you aren't going to eat this, Percy begged. His host frowned, glancing at the meal in confusion. Why not? It was the half-eaten corpse of some kind of rodent, twice as large as a rat, though it also had 6 limbs and its face was more flat. For starters, you have a hole in your stomach. Can you even eat? It's not in my stomach. Mickey rolled his eyes. Besides, I'd very much like to have one more meal, even if it kills me. What's there to like? It's rotten. Mickey made the cackly sound again. Percy wanted to strangle him so damn much. What are you, some kind of princess? Don't tell me you only eat fresh kills where you're from. The bastard didn't even wait for a reply before pecking a chunk off the corpse. Percy hurriedly summoned his status. He'd been itching to do that since getting here and he desperately needed a distraction from the He needed a distraction. Mictlantecuhtli, Percival's clone. What's that? Mickey asked, a bone snapping inside his beak. Percy wanted to swear. I'll tell you if you stop eating. His annoying host shrugged, tossing the rest of his meal inside his mouth, chewing it a couple of times before guzzling it down. They're all done. It took Percy over a minute to recover. His main body would have nightmares of the spoiled rat meat for years. It's my status. Do you not have it here? Mickey shook his head. Percy hadn't known it was something exclusive to Remir. Either way, he read the rest, eager to find out if there was anything of value in this place. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Yellow.
Ew.
Mana core 2. Seed.
Ew. Ew. Hey.
Grants access to your status.
Hey.
Incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. The hell? What? Both exclaimed at the same time. Why do I have a second mana core? I'd very much like to know that myself, Percy said. It's something I picked up from that baby I mentioned. It followed me home, but I didn't realize all my clones would have it too. But why is it incomplete? Mickey asked again. Indeed, why was it? Percy would have understood had it been fractured instead, requiring both mind and life mana like the first time. Apparently, the former part had stuck with him for whatever reason. Does it matter? Is what he ended up saying. More importantly, can you think of a source of life mana we can tap into? A spark of annoyance passed through their bond. Do I look like I can get life mana? Mickey gestured at his wound. Good point. At the end of the day, they didn't really need to awaken their second core. They wouldn't live long enough to use it anyway. Percy was more disappointed by the lack of another of those mysterious perks he could bring back to Remir. This trip was swiftly turning into a dud. At least tell me you know your mana type. Of course I do. All the natives of Huehue have a pure affinity, Mickey replied proudly. But the young man wasn't impressed. No wonder they were enslaved, he thought before realizing his gaffe. Damn. I'm sorry. That was such a shitty thing to think. However, his host hadn't taken offense. You'd think that, yet it wasn't weakness that turned us into targets. It was something else. Percy wanted to ask, but he didn't want to be insensitive. It's fine. I don't mind talking about it. Mickey seemed about to elaborate when they heard footsteps. Percy felt a wave of disgust oozing from his host as soon as the figure stepped into their sight. He appeared to be of the same species as Mickey, though he lacked the tattoos and scars, dressed in clean, expensive clothes. The guard stopped by the entrance, searching through the keys strapped to his belt. Actually, scratch that. It'll be easier to show you why my people got enslaved, Mickey said, before adding, my next fight is about to begin.